And it's about time we've talked about Mars once again. More updates, more exciting discoveries, and actually some discoveries that nobody expected. But I usually start these Mars videos with some kind of a really cool picture from one of the Martian missions. And this time we might even have two. Here's the first one. Now you can probably tell what this is, mostly because around this time we're going to be having one of these right here on planet Earth. But this is essentially a lunar eclipse, but a version from Mars. This is Moon Phobos passing in front of the Sun, and this picture was taken by Perseverance rover in February of 2024. You can actually find the raw images for this if you look in one of the links in the description that has a lot of raw images from Perseverance. Here you have to look under February 8 and you'll actually see over 70 pictures basically from the beginning of the lunar eclipse to the end. But the second picture I wanted to show you is this. This is basically the end of Ingenuity. These images were actually posted a while back, but were then processed by a German university student, Simon Schmaup. And intriguingly, he even located the missing blade. It was hidden in the sand 15 meters away from Ingenuity. And since this image was taken from approximately half a kilometer away, or about 1500 feet away, finding this was probably not very easy. And so after 72 flights, this is how the mission ends. Or does it? Because apparently it's not over yet. As a matter of fact, apparently, it's still kind of doing science. And this is something that was recently reported during one of the NASA streams, and something you can confirm yourself if you once again go to that raw image section and look at some of the images from Ingenuity. It's still releasing images very actively, but it seems to have only one shot in all of them. They all basically kinda look like this. But there is a method to this madness. This is all science. It's taking pictures of exactly the same spot and sending them back to Earth from its downward facing camera. And this only has one purpose: learning about geological processes on Mars by sort of creating a time-lapse showing us how all of this changes over time. Now it's not done yet, it's actually not done processing the images, and it's going to be taking a few more, but eventually this will probably teach us a lot about how dust and various tiny particles of rock respond to Martian weather and Martian wind. So yeah, talk about one mission that just doesn't want to end, and a mission that's overachieved way beyond what was expected. And so we'll probably come back and talk more about the helicopter once there are some updates once again. Although I guess calling it a helicopter is no longer appropriate. It's more of a stationary, single-blade camera at this point. Here's actually another really cool video from Perseverance itself, showing us how it kind of looks to drive on Mars. But Perseverance is obviously conducting a lot of important scientific studies. And here, by using some of the recent radar images, researchers actually realized that it's in the perfect location to find fossilized life, if it ever existed here. And that's because this location, Jezero Crater, seems to contain a lot of telltale signs of what seems to be a lake bed and signs of an ancient river. And specifically, there are signs that this crater was formed 4 billion years ago and later filled with a lake that eventually resulted in a lot of sediments very similar to what we find in lakes and rivers on Earth. And much of the sediment here was probably carried from all over the place. And so if there was any life present here, it would have been carried into this lake by all of these rivers, and some of these sediments might have been already picked up by Perseverance and could actually have signs of life inside of them already. But unfortunately, there's really no way for us to remotely establish this, and so the samples have to be retrieved, or someone has to go there and try to analyze it on site. And so even though we actually see signs of various organic compounds, at the moment there is no way to determine if they're biogenetic or abiogenetic, or basically produced by life or just through natural processes. But at least one of the mysteries of these processes has been recently solved by another study you can find in the description. And this is actually one of the oldest mysteries on Mars that has always kind of hinted on the potential existence of life somewhere on the surface. For several decades now, researchers have observed signs of methane that seems to fluctuate in the Martian atmosphere. Now we know that on planet Earth, methane can either come from natural geological processes or sometimes from life, actually quite a lot of times from life. And when we see something that's cyclical or periodic, very often it's actually the life that's causing it and not necessarily geological activity. And this periodicity was officially confirmed by Curiosity, as you can see right here. So it seems to actually change seasonally, as if something grows on Mars in the summer and in the fall, and then disappears in the winter. So kind of like trees or something, right? Or I guess some kind of a bacteria. And that by itself was a really groundbreaking discovery for astrobiology, but naturally there was no evidence of anything alive yet. Luckily this time nobody jumped the gun and started to claim that this is indeed life. This time scientists were actually really careful, and that sort of paid off. It doesn't seem to be life, at least for now. Once again, the source of this methane is very likely geological and possibly from somewhere underground. As always, you can find this study in the description, but in essence this was a study that modeled how methane is absorbed by various rocks when there is no life present inside of them, which is actually a temperature-dependent process. In other words, in certain temperatures, rocks absorb more methane. In other temperatures, they absorb less. And so these simulations actually predicted that there should be a kind of a methane pulse right before Martian sunrise, especially during the northern summer season that just recently ended. And turns out that the observations from Mars seem to confirm this. So the levels of methane don't just fluctuate seasonally, they also fluctuate daily. Something that we actually did not know before. But more specifically, they were able to explain what's happening here. And specifically the observations from Curiosity rover. These emissions seem to be driven by barometric pressure, or basically atmospheric pressure, that seems to pump methane into certain locations depending on the time of the day, and thus changes the variation, making it appear periodic. And so basically it's a combination of air pressure, wind, and the temperature of certain rocks. With all of this essentially recreated in their study by using very porous rocks that we know are present on Mars as well. And so, at least for now, once again, it doesn't actually look like this is life either. This explanation right now makes a lot of sense. And more importantly, it might even answer questions about objects like Titan, where similar patterns have been detected in the past. And so methane, despite being one of the most important biosignatures, potentially can fool us this way as well. But it doesn't mean that life here does not exist. As a matter of fact, one of the more recent astrobiological studies discovered something really interesting. Here they recreated similar conditions to Mars inside a lab, basically using a Martian regolith replica, very cold temperatures, low atmospheric pressure, no oxygen, and quite a lot of radiation. And then they took 4 different bacterial species and put them inside, just to see what happens. And all 4 of these bacteria are known to infect humans as well, so this was actually to test if some of the bacteria that are deadly to us can maybe endanger some of the Martian missions. Turns out they can. All 4 bacteria were capable of surviving in these hostile conditions for a relatively long time. And though some of them were not able to grow and were just surviving for maybe a day or so, eventually coming to their demise, with one of the main reasons being lack of water, one of them, Pseudomonas aeruginosa, a multi-drug resistant pathogen that can be actually found everywhere, was somehow able to not just survive but multiply and thrive, basically making these fake Martian conditions its new home. Now the other ones survived for approximately 3 weeks or so still quite impressive, but just the fact that one of them was able to basically live on Mars is a huge discovery. First of all, suggesting that the astronauts going to Mars will have to be super careful. There's a really high chance some of these pathogens might easily survive in the Martian colony and thus result in a lot of different sicknesses. But second of all, it means that if life ever lived here, it might still be there as well. If an Earth bacteria can survive on Mars, so why not a Martian bacteria? Definitely an important astrobiological discovery. And on top of astrobiology, we had some really important discoveries about Martian geology. One of the first studies that you can find in the description makes an interesting proposition. Basically, Mars potentially had its own version of plate tectonics for a very long time. But instead of being horizontal plate tectonics like on Earth, where basically plates move under one another, forming a lot of different geological formations, on Mars it might have been something slightly different. Here plate tectonics might have been vertical and most likely caused by a multitude of enormous volcanoes everywhere. Something that most likely happened on early Earth 3 to 4 billion years ago as well. And so this is actually called vertical tectonics. In essence, it kind of looks like this. The planet's crust collapses into the planet's mantle, melts and reforms inside of it, and then gets injected with high concentration of silica through enormous volcanoes around the surface. And though this might sound far-fetched, it actually explains one important observation from the surface of Mars. It explains very high levels of silica, usually around or inside volcanoes all over Mars. And it also explains why Martian volcanoes ended up being so enormous compared to what we have on Earth. It was basically the only way for the planet to release all of the heat from inside and to basically maintain its own geological processes. Which also meant that there was definitely some kind of a recycling going on and some kind of an evolution of magma very similar to what happened on early Earth. And on Earth, as you probably know, around this time that's when life formed as well. So yeah, why not Mars? And because this also explains what very likely happened on our own planet, this is a very important process to study just to understand if this can happen elsewhere as well. But interestingly, researchers from a completely different field and studying something entirely different completely by accident discovered yet another enormous volcano right in the plain view. The giant volcano you see right there. Now it currently does not have an official name, but the researchers are calling this Noctis volcano, just because of the Noctis labyrinthus that's next to it. But this volcano also seems to be hiding a possible sheet of buried glacier ice, and it's huge in size. This volcano is at least 450 kilometers across and is elevated up to about 9 kilometers. That's absolutely enormous, with the geology around it suggesting that it was probably active for a very long time. The researchers even suggest that there's a chance it might still be active even today, just dormant for now. And so here the researchers found 5,000 square kilometers of various volcanic deposits, a sign of extreme activity over millions and millions of years. And though it might not resemble a volcano from a distance, there's definitely a telltale sign of a caldera remnant right there. And it very likely contains some kind of an ancient lava lake. Yet around it we see signs of a lot of typical volcanic activity. Signs of pyroclastic flows, lava flows, but also a lot of hydrated minerals, and more importantly, unusually broken terrain that was actually produced through explosive steam venting, which actually suggests one really important thing. It means that a lot of this hot volcanic material most likely interacted with a lot of water or ice-rich surface, resulting in massive explosions and the terrain we're observing. So in other words, there is a lot of hidden water and potentially a massive glacier. But because this was such a long time ago, and because this is such an ancient active volcano, over time it changed dramatically in shape, and so it does not look like one anymore. But in terms of chemistry, and specifically minerals found here, such as for example sulfate deposits, mostly made out of jarosite, a kind of a hydrous sulfate, cannot be explained in any other way except for interaction of pyroclastic materials with a lot of water or ice, resulting in specific chemical reactions that we also observe on Earth. And because of these conditions, including liquid water and a lot of warmth, the obvious question is, could this have been a source of life? And so yeah, this is definitely now a prime location to start looking for a lot of exciting stuff, including water deposits and maybe bacterial life. And last but not least, there was another study that decided to focus on craters. And here we're talking about asteroid craters, focusing on one called Corinto. It was created approximately 2.3 million years ago and was very likely a result of a collision under a certain angle. And this allowed the scientists to then try to figure out where all of the leftovers and all of the explosive debris ended up landing. And here they actually wanted to answer one simple question: how many additional craters would be created as a result of the ejecta from the main explosion? And while the results were maybe a little bit surprising, they've discovered over 2 billion secondary impact craters that were larger than 10 meters in size, implying that many of the craters on Mars are very likely secondary ejecta and were not caused by the main impactor. And also some of them landed as far as 1800 kilometers away, basically making this a really powerful event, but also an event that very likely happened many times, transforming the Martian surface and making it appear as it appears today. But once again, interestingly, there are signs of some kind of an interaction with water. This asteroid, when it hit Mars, seems to have landed in a location full of water ice, because there are a lot of signs of degassing and signs of the interaction with superheated ice. So once again confirming that there are a lot of water deposits everywhere, and a lot of them are basically hidden as underground ice. Naturally important for astrobiology studies, but also important for any potential crewed mission in the future. And on that note, that's pretty much all I wanted to mention. Lots of different exciting discoveries and a lot of really good research and some really cool pictures. Today we're discussing a few more discoveries from the Red Planet and a couple of announcements from NASA. One of them, maybe not so good. And so, hello wonderful person, this is Anton. Let's discuss the Red Planet once again, And let's just get the bad news out of the way right now. And the bad news here is coming from the Perseverance mission, one of the most impressive missions by NASA in the last few years. Here's actually a really cool shot of the Perseverance rover drilling into one of its most exciting rocks. This is literally a perfect sample. A sample 24 collected extremely recently, something that was most likely formed in liquid conditions and potentially hides signs of ancient life. And so NASA scientists are obviously very eager to collect this, somehow. And they had a mission planned for this. It was known as the Sample Return Mission. A mission that was supposed to collect all of these samples dropped by Perseverance by using either individual rovers or maybe even a helicopter to basically collect everything and to then send it back to Earth. In this case, by very likely using some kind of a launch vehicle, such as a tiny rocket, which would actually also be the first time ever we launched a rocket from another planet. And so this mission was technically feasible, technically doable, and potentially super exciting. However, turns out that additional analysis established that this would be super expensive, like way more expensive than anyone thought. It would be up to about $11 billion, and that's just way too much compared to what it was supposed to be, which is under $2 billion. And so as a result of this, extremely recently, NASA administration basically announced that, at least for now, they're going to kind of postpone it or possibly even cancel it. Mostly because, as it stands right now, this would not even happen until possibly 2040, and that's just way too long. And so instead what NASA is planning to do now is seek alternatives. They're basically trying to redesign everything in order to actually conduct the sample return sometimes before 2035. And that's actually because 2033 is the perfect year to send a bunch of missions to Mars because of the alignment of Mars, Earth, and the Sun. But I guess one of the biggest reasons why this was basically postponed and almost cancelled is the recent announcement from the Congress. The announcement for major cuts, approximately $2 billion per year, when it comes to various NASA programs and actually a lot of scientific programs in general. And this was somewhat unexpected and I guess somewhat unfortunate. And though I'm sure people in the comments are going to be blaming various administrations, like Biden and Trump and so on, the reality is that this is something that's been happening for the past 2 to 3 decades. Except for a slight peak in early 90s, pretty much every single year, the NASA budget has been decreasing by at least a little bit. In terms of percentage of the federal budget, it was about 1% in the 90s, 0.75% in 2000s, 0.5% by 2012, and basically close to about 0.45% now. And that's really the unfortunate reality of modern scientific studies and modern research. We obviously had this huge excitement in the 60s and the 70s with the entire lunar race and basically a lot of exciting research when it comes to planetary sciences, but now, unfortunately, not so much. Which is actually why in the last few years, you might have seen how NASA tried to dramatically transform what they're doing and specifically focus on social media, making everything look a lot more exciting. But even that did not seem to work because they're still losing budget, which is already causing some major problems for science, such as the shutdown of the Chandra telescope that we're going to be discussing in a separate video, and now the potential cancellation of this incredible Martian mission. But they're not cancelling one of the most exciting missions in the next decade. They're basically trying to save all of their money for the mission to Titan. And so here all of the lessons from Mars are going to be applied to this new helicopter that's going to be going to Saturn's moon Titan in order to explore it in the next 10 years. It's going to be arriving to Titan in 2034, but is going to leave Earth in 2028. And so here I guess they had to kind of prioritize things, but it doesn't mean that we're going to be losing these samples and that the Martian mission is basically over. As I mentioned, NASA is just trying to change how they do things and possibly start relying less on the government, approaching the private sector instead. And so I guess we'll see how this goes, but in the next 3 to 4 years, we might see some major changes. Right now though, it's all a bit uncertain. But anyway, let's move on to some other stuff. Hey, what happened to that helicopter? Well, this is the last photo. It's still there, it's still working, it's still transmitting, but it now had its goodbye party. This is basically the end for the helicopter as well. Here's actually that first ever video filmed of the helicopter flying on Mars. This is of course one of the most exciting videos ever. And so at least for now, Ingenuity is essentially going to be a kind of a stationary scientific module. It's going to remain on Mars collecting all of the possible data it can, including images, and then transmit them when it can. But once the perseverance is too far and the transmissions become impossible, it's just going to write all of this data into its hard drive, and apparently it can store up to 20 years of information. And so here the hope is that maybe in the next 20 years, we might come back here and physically pick it up with some kind of a manned mission. Nevertheless, after 1000 Martian days and 72 flights, this is basically how it kind of ends. Here's actually the last ever picture it took while flying, and this is right before it kind of crashed. Or I guess it didn't really crash as much as landed hard, but hard enough to separate its blade. And so for the foreseeable future, it's just going to remain stationary in the location known as Valinor Hills, which is actually a really appropriate name because Valinor is the resting place for the elves in the Tolkien's universe or the Lord of the Rings. And so yeah, just like the elves, it's going to rest here. But the data it's collecting might be useful for future missions. Specifically missions using other flying vehicles, because it's trying to collect data about the environment, the climate, the dust movement, and the overall weather. And that's basically to help the scientists design something even better and even more efficient. But I guess for now, that's pretty much it for this helicopter. Although you can still buy that t-shirt that features the helicopter in one of the links in the description. Shameless self-promotion. Anyway, moving on. Let's I guess now talk about actual scientific discoveries and something slightly more positive. Let's start with the moons. As you might be aware, Mars has two moons, Phobos and Deimos. But they're not really as moon-looking as our moon. They basically kind of look like two large asteroids, approximately 27 and 15 kilometers across. But because they're kind of similar and because they orbit around Mars relatively close to the planet, it's always been curious to find out how exactly were they formed. There have been some previous propositions that you can learn more about in one of the videos in the description, but in essence it was believed to be either a single object that crashed on Mars forming these in the process, or maybe they were just captured asteroids from the asteroid belt, or something in between. But this new proposition kind of actually makes a little bit more sense. Turns out that their surface seems to actually be very similar to a typical comet, such as the famous 67P Churyumov-Gerasimenko, the bilobal comet we got to visit a few years back. And for some reason, the surface features here seem to be extremely similar, at least based on the external observations. Or at least they appear to be more similar to a comet than a typical asteroid from the asteroid belt, especially in the way that the light is reflected and in the external composition on the surface. And because of this new proposition suggests that maybe they were actually a comet and were extremely similar to 67P. In essence, they might have been a bilobal or a binary comet that was basically stuck as a single piece, but that eventually got separated as it approached Mars because of tidal interactions. Here's a 3D model of that comet, and as you can see here, the two pieces are not really that different from what we observe around Mars, and even size-wise they're very similar. But one of the main reasons this proposition makes more sense is because of the similarity of orbits of these two moons. Just to give you a visual example, so here is Deimos and here is Phobos. Obviously closer, but surprisingly similar in terms of inclination, in terms of eccentricity and everything else. And so it would actually make sense that if this was a single object and it basically fell apart, these two separate pieces would have very similar orbits at the end. So in other words, in order for them to have similar orbits, they must have had some kind of a similar origin. But at least for now, we're not really going to know more because these are just speculations. But we will have a mission really soon by JAXA or the Japanese Space Agency that's going to launch in 2026 and it's going to return samples back to Earth by 2031. This is known as MMX or Martian Moons Exploration. And by bringing those samples back, we can then definitely tell if this is an asteroid or a comet, which would very likely explain their origin. Although by itself, capturing a comet is of course not unusual. We know that for example Saturn has Phoebe, which probably has very similar origins. And so at least for now, that's really all we know, but it's definitely a super cool explanation. But then we have another discovery from around Mars, another asteroid, but this time what's known as a Trojan. Now the most famous Trojans in the solar system are the asteroids around Jupiter. These are essentially rocks that orbit in the L4 and L5 Lagrange points, or permanent gravitational points, where they can technically stay for millions and even billions of years. And Jupiter has a lot of them. Maybe millions, maybe billions. But that's because Jupiter is really massive. And there is a mission headed here as well. You can learn about this mission in one of the videos in the description. But one of the other planets that has a lot of Trojans is Mars. And it looks like a scientific team whose paper you can find in the description discovered another one. number 17, currently referred to as 2023 FW14. Technically discovered in 2023, but it did take a while to confirm. But more intriguingly, this is only the second rock in the L4 point. 15 others are in the L5 point. And even more importantly, it seems to have a different chemical composition and different surface properties compared to the other ones discovered so far. Specifically, it seems to be very primitive and potentially billions of years old, possibly containing some of the most pristine material in the entire solar system, which is not really the case for other Trojans, as they usually show signs of interaction. Although there's actually another major difference. Most of the Trojans around Mars potentially stayed here for billions of years. These are relatively permanent orbits, and even Jupiter doesn't seem to be able to dislodge them, as many of them stayed here for a long time. But the recent calculations here suggest that this is a new arrival and may also leave in the next 10 million years. So it doesn't seem to have long-term stability. Although because of its similarity to the other Trojan discovered back in the 90s, and especially the appearance of this being relatively primitive and untouched, basically suggests that both of these rocks possibly came from the same object, whereas all of the other Trojans seem to be very rocky, relatively rich in silicates, and are true asteroids as opposed to being primitive undeveloped bodies similar to comets. Nevertheless, still a pretty cool discovery, and possibly another good opportunity for someone like the Japanese Space Agency to maybe go and explore and collect more samples. These Trojans are also super exciting, so I'm actually surprised nobody has planned a mission here yet. And then last but not least, we have another study confirming once again that there seem to be certain regions on Mars that very likely had water much longer than we ever thought. This recent study you can find in the description once again confirms the existence of liquid water based on the analysis of recent samples from the Curiosity rover, the samples that could only be produced in liquid water in much more recent times than we ever believed. And though it was always believed that the water disappeared possibly 3 billion years ago, or even earlier than that, a lot of data here suggests that it very likely existed much longer. And though maybe not as a liquid ocean on the surface, and instead some kind of underground water, or even salty water, it was definitely there. And it still might be there underneath the surface in relatively large quantities, as we've discussed in one of the recent videos about exciting new discoveries in the last few months. That video should be in the description as well. But anyway, on that note, definitely some cool discoveries here and there, but also some bad news about the Martian mission and the status of NASA when it comes to funding. Okay, let's start with this really cool shot of Mars. Because today, even though we're discussing our own planet, planet Earth, it's really Mars that seems to be the reason something is happening on Earth every 2.5 million years. And so, hello wonderful person, this is Anton. Today we're going to discuss this somewhat new study that, completely by accident, discovered that planet Earth goes through very specific cycles because of Mars. And though this shouldn't really come as a surprise because a lot of other planets influence planet Earth in a lot of different ways, what is surprising is that these effects are observable in a lot of sediment and seem to be relatively significant. So yeah, technically this is going to be a climate video, so I think you're going to have one of those side notes automatically added by YouTube somewhere below. And so today we're going to be discussing a kind of an unusual climate change. A climate change that seems to be directly caused by a planet, but something that we kind of understand pretty well. This is a type of a Milankovitch cycle. Various effects in regards to the Earth's movements around the solar system, usually influencing things like eccentricity or axial tilt or precession, that were officially confirmed by looking at various sediments back in 1976. And we know that there are different cycles that seem to have different lengths, usually in thousands of years, but some of them seem to be very dramatic. And there's a lot of evidence that the modern ice ages are very likely the result of the Milankovitch cycles as well, with quite a lot of them discovered in the last decade or so through various simulations involving the solar system, but without actual understanding of what effects they might have on the planet just yet. Although here it's important to highlight that these cycles are very long term. They don't actually just happen overnight, and they usually take thousands of years to develop, with some of the shorter ones taking at least a few hundred years. And that's because orbital changes, or the way Earth spins around its axis, does take some time to actually take effect. But the evidence is very clear. It comes from a lot of different samples, from a lot of different sources, but time and time again we see these unusual cyclical formations. Here's an example of levels of CO2 discovered in different ice cores going back 400,000 years. And so in this recent study that as always you can find in the description below, researchers discovered yet another cycle completely by accident. But they were studying something entirely different. And here this is actually a really good segue into the dangers of modern headlines. This was actually posted and reposted in a lot of different media, and was essentially something like this. Ocean currents are going to shut down as early as 2025, leading to a climate disaster. Although if you do keep reading, it does say that it's between 2025 and maybe 2095. Either way, this unusual headline was republished in a lot of different media sources and did make a lot of climatologists somewhat upset, because it's actually kind of wrong. It's completely incorrect and is not at all what climatologists were trying to say. They did discover that the currents at the bottom of the ocean are actually going to change because the water is going to be getting warmer and warmer. But the problem is that it's actually unknown if it's going to become stronger or weaker. And although some models did discover that the circulation system, especially in the Gulf Stream, could maybe shut down if the global sea ice melts completely, there were different models suggesting something entirely different. And so, in other words, at the end of that particular study, it was determined that it was unclear and more studies were necessary. And the media, like The Guardian, said, no, the Gulf Stream is shutting down, let's publish it. Although maybe check out some of the additional links in the description from actual climate scientists that do give us a slightly different story. And so because of this somewhat alarmist headline, and also because of basically unclear results from previous studies, a different group of researchers wanted to take a look at more sediments, going back in time just to see what they actually discover and if they can find more answers. Once again, mostly focusing on the Gulf Stream, because that's the one that's kind of making everyone nervous. Although in this study they did have an extremely large sample, involving different types of drilling sites across different stations, just to get as much data as possible. In this case, they based their analysis on 293 scientific deep-sea drill holes from various locations, exploring evidence from sediment all the way to 70 million years ago. And when it comes to sediment in the ocean, and especially when it comes to the current strength, we know that when the current is overall stronger, there's a kind of a break in sediment, naturally because water carries things farther and the sedimentation process is not as efficient. But when the current slows down and when the water is not as powerful, there's a much more steady sediment accumulation, which in essence kind of appears similar to, I guess, tree rings. And so by looking at nearly 400 different breaks in a lot of these sediments, they were able to plot a kind of a change over time, noticing something really unusual. There was a kind of a cycle, roughly around 2.4 million years in length. A cycle that also correlated with some of the biggest events in Earth's history in the last 50 million years. For example, the famous PETM, the event when the Earth was suddenly extremely hot that we've discussed in one of the previous videos, that occurred approximately 56 million years ago. During this time, Earth's temperature was approximately 8 degrees warmer on average than it was a million years prior. Some of the videos in the description explore this period a little bit better. And strangely enough, this unusual cycle seems to actually be somewhat similar to a resonance between Earth and Mars. In other words, the gravitational interaction between Mars and planet Earth potentially results in some sort of a change in Earth's oceans that seems to recur every 2.4 million years. In other words, this is also a kind of a Milankovitch cycle, but much longer than any of the other ones, and maybe with different effects. And this is of course not really surprising. All of the other cycles are very likely caused by Jupiter and Saturn, but those two planets are really massive, thus resulting in much more dramatic effects. Mars though is not, but it's much closer. And because it does form a resonance with planet Earth, this seems to have some sort of an effect on Earth after all. Now they don't actually call it Milankovitch cycle, here they just refer to it as the grand cycle, but it's definitely some sort of a pattern linked to the orbital alignments. And if this is correct, it also seems to have somewhat intriguing effects on the planet. First effect is higher solar radiation. This could be due to some kind of an orbital change, such as for example reduced eccentricity, or maybe reduction in the magnetosphere. The actual reasons are still unknown. But the second effect seems to be warmer climate. Now this is obviously something that happens over much longer periods, very likely taking hundreds of thousands of years to become noticeable, but that's in essence one of the discoveries from this study. And because we know that there is a link between Milankovitch cycles and ice ages, this should not come as a surprise. But it does raise an intriguing question. If Mars does this to us, what about Venus? Venus is much closer and more massive, and so the overall effects should be even more pronounced. So far there's no evidence for any of this, but if they're correct about Mars, there should be signs from Venus as well. And if it does affect the planet, it's probably by affecting the eccentricity. it's unlikely to affect anything else. But I guess even more importantly, they discovered additional evidence in regards to ocean circulation. It's quite likely that the ocean circulation is not going to be stopping anytime soon, with this new data suggesting that the oceans seem to be very resilient and don't actually change currents that frequently. There is a chance that the ocean currents might weaken within the next 100 years if the ice completely melts, but there seem to be mechanisms in the oceans that prevent it from stopping completely, at least based on the data from this study and from these 300 sites around the planet. But intriguingly, that Martian cycle, at its maximum, seems to intensify water circulation that does affect the climate. And some of the more extreme periods on the planet, where the temperature was really hot, were very likely caused by ocean circulation changes, with many of them maybe the result of orbital interactions, or so-called astronomical forcing. And so I guess just another cycle for us to learn about and to try to understand how it affects our planet. But because once again it's Mars and it's relatively small and not very massive, there is maybe still a chance that something else is causing this, or the effects are not as dramatic. Now, definitely visible in the sediment and definitely affecting the planet to some extent, but it's really probably the combination of a lot of different cycles all sort of happening at the same time that usually causes these extreme events, such as the one that happened 56 million years ago. Definitely an intriguing discovery, and something we'll come back and talk more about once there's more information and additional discoveries. It's time for another update from planet Mars. More exciting discoveries, intriguing news from the Martian helicopter, and an incredible discovery of a huge water deposit we never knew existed. Okay, wait up. Editing Anton. Last minute changes. Now I had to make some updates for the video because we have some news about the helicopter. And you can probably guess what it is, but we'll talk about this in a few minutes. And so, hello wonderful person, this is Anton. Let's talk about some of these recent discoveries from just the last few months, and of course about what all of this means when it comes to understanding this beautiful red planet. But, as in some of the previous videos about Mars, I once again wanted to start this with a strange image and a somewhat interesting video. And so here we have an image recently captured by the Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter, an unusual series of very strange lines carved into the Martian surface, as if someone dragged something really heavy on the surface. And, not surprisingly, this is something that formed over time through very minute motions of surface ice on top of the Martian soil. But in this case, this motion very likely took a really long time, possibly even several thousand years. And more importantly, these patterns were captured in non-polar regions of Mars, providing evidence that Martian ice seems to be present in a lot of different regions, not just in the Martian poles. And then we also have this really cool time-lapse from the Martian Curiosity rover. This time-lapse, representing only 17 frames, was captured by 2 cameras and was actually filmed right before the solar conjunction, or basically the period when the sun blocks Mars from planet Earth and does not allow scientists to communicate with rovers or any Martian missions for something like 2 weeks. And so just for funsies, the researchers decided to make these time-lapses, basically showing us 12 hours on the surface of Mars. But what's really cool here is, well, actually right here. Inside these images, we get to see various effects that anyone would experience on the surface of Mars. This unusual black dot, that's literally a cosmic ray hitting the camera. A very powerful cosmic ray that on Earth would be blocked by the atmosphere. But just the time-lapse itself is obviously really cool. You can find both of these videos in the links in the description. Okay, now for the actual discoveries. And let's start with, I guess, the biggest one. The discovery based on the radar survey of a really large region known as Medusa Fossae. It actually kind of resembles this, and it was always believed to be the result of volcanic activity. Here is roughly where this region is located, and the important part here is that it's basically on the equator. And so during the recent radar observations, researchers were able to scan underneath the ground here, collecting a lot of data based on the reflections of the radar from just underneath the surface. This was done using the Marsis radar on top of Mars Express. And what's super intriguing here is that they found these unusual anomalies that resembled something we've seen previously, very close to the Martian polar caps. And back then, very similar observations were interpreted to be, very likely, huge deposits of thick ice. But in the polar regions, this is maybe expected. We do observe a lot of ice on the surface here, even though technically this is CO2 ice, with most of this ice changing throughout the year. But the discovery of ice underneath suggested that it's maybe water ice. But now very similar observations were discovered here, And though at first it was not actually known what kind of deposits these were, because it could have been volcanic or maybe just sediments or even sand, by using modeling and computer simulations, the only way scientists were able to create similar structures was basically if this was water ice. Water ice was the only substance that contained enough density and enough structure support to make all of this possible. With this region known as Humidities dorsum very likely containing the highest and the thickest deposit of ice. But all of this buried underneath several hundred meters of actual Martian crust, and thus very likely stored inside for billions of years. And when I read about this, almost right away, it reminded me of Total Recall. If you watch the movie, you might remember that there's basically a hidden layer of ice that the government is trying to hide from everyone because they're trying to control the population. And if all of this ice is melted, it supposedly instantly terraforms Mars. Which is exactly what Arnold Schwarzenegger does in the movie. He presses a magic alien button, which starts the terraforming process. Now obviously no signs of aliens or magic buttons, but surprisingly, actual evidence for enormous amounts of ice. How much ice? Apparently enough to potentially create a tiny ocean on the entire Mars. Some of this ice is at least 3.7 kilometers thick, and so if melted, it might create an ocean that's approximately 3 meters deep. Not a very large ocean, but still that means that there is a lot of water hidden underneath. And this discovery by itself is important for one reason. It potentially finally solves the mystery of what happened to Martian water billions of years ago. Because here on Mars, we have so many signs of water from a lot of previous events, even signs of tsunami, something you can learn more about in one of the videos in the description. But where exactly did this water go? Did it just evaporate and escape into space? Did it get locked up in rock through some kind of a chemical process? Or is it hiding underneath? And this evidence here does suggest that huge amounts of it is very likely still underneath. But unfortunately for any potential crewed mission, it's going to be beyond our reach. Some of it is actually several kilometers deep inside the ground, and so it would be extremely difficult to reach this. Nevertheless, one day, if we do actually find a way to somehow mine this, it might actually help us somehow transform Mars into something a little bit more hospitable. Just like in the Total Recall. Okay, yeah, it's unlikely to be like that, and Mars is unlikely to turn into an Earth-like planet overnight, but nevertheless, this is a really exciting discovery, potentially solving a lot of mysteries. And that of course includes a lot of other discoveries about evidence of all of this water from the past. Based on all of the evidence we see on the surface, it looks like Mars did not lose its water in a single episode. It very likely was something that happened over billions of years, with several episodes resurfacing water and making Mars once again liquid for at least some time. And so here we have a lot of evidence of flowing water that happened several times in the past, with a lot of these river valleys actually containing extremely different age. And so in one of the recent studies, researchers were able to determine an approximate age of some of these river valleys by using an intriguing dating technique using asteroid craters. And so by using several of these craters, and determining the average age based on the size and what we know about craters from objects like the moon, here it was discovered that some of these rivers were hundreds of millions of years apart. And some of these regions even contained several major episodes of flowing water, suggesting major climatic changes that happen on the planet once in a while. With some of this evidence basically presenting Mars in a slightly different way. It might have had lakes and rivers in this case had a lot of flowing water, but this might have been an extremely rare event, with Mars staying more or less arid and dry for the large portion of the time in between these dramatic climatic changes, with additional evidence suggesting that the erosion rate for rivers was extremely low, suggesting that the rivers were very likely flowing very infrequently, remaining dry completely, which by itself presents Mars in the last 3 billion years in a very different way. It might have actually been kind of similar to deserts like Sahara, for the most part being dry and extremely arid, but once in a while experiencing these very dramatic river flows and even a large expansion of lakes and oceans, which would last for some time but disappear with time afterwards. With all of this very likely driven by some kind of a Milankovitch cycle, something that happens possibly every 100,000 years or so, due to the orbit of the planet around the solar system. And if correct, this would have important implications for the potential existence of life on Mars. Life here would have a lot of trouble developing and evolving if this planet was mostly dry and desert-like for most of its existence. And so these occasional water flows would not really give life enough chance to evolve. And so instead of providing life with a long-term stability like on planet Earth, Mars instead seemed to have a lot of variability and was thus a lot more inhospitable compared to planet Earth. But that's just based on one study, and so we'll probably find out more in some of the future follow-up studies that might explore this a little bit more. But using very similar data, a lot of other scientists actually discovered something else about Mars that was a bit surprising. Here, by once again comparing the surface features with the data from ground-penetrating radar, especially focusing on regions like Elysium Planitia, researchers identified at least 40 different volcanic events, with some surprisingly only happening a few million years ago. And considering the recent data from the now retired InSight mission that actually did establish that there seems to be even signs of potential volcanic activity today, you can learn more about this in the video in the description. What this essentially suggests is that these volcanic eruptions seem to be a lot more frequent and seem to also happen in recent geologic times. And more importantly, they're very likely the reason why some of the groundwater is suddenly released on the surface, possibly forming signs of these rivers and lakes. Especially because this recent study even found signs of the interaction of lava and water visible in some of the rocks on the surface. And some of these formations were millions of years old, not billions, once again implying recent volcanism and recent releases of underground water, making Mars a somewhat exciting place and potentially not as dead as we always believed it to be. And last but not least, let's talk about the Martian helicopter and how it seems to be still going, even though there have been a few problems in the last few months. And okay, yeah, it's not really going anywhere anymore, so I'm sorry for bad news. But let's first discuss what I was going to say in the video, and then we'll discuss new updates. So first of all, as of making of this video, this helicopter has now finished its 72nd flight. It was supposed to only fly for 30 days and complete 3 flights. It's now been over 1,000 days and over 72 flights. And so this team right here achieved something absolutely incredible. But despite of this, there have been a few glitches. Actually, one of the first major glitches occurred during the 52nd flight. This was in April of 2023, and after this flight, the helicopter actually landed somewhere where it was not able to communicate with Perseverance. It was essentially just a little bit too far away, but this was technically done on purpose. It landed in the location where the Perseverance is sort of headed, and so the helicopter handlers decided to stay ahead of the Perseverance by making it land somewhere where the rover was headed. And so for 2 weeks, the helicopter was just patiently waiting, and after 61 days, the communication was re-established and it seemed to be still working. Intriguingly, at this time, it landed very close to a bunch of pebbles, something that the scientists using the Perseverance rover really wanted to take a look at, so they basically changed the direction in order to take a look at those pebbles and to take a few samples. Flight 53 is when the second problem started. It experienced a never-before-seen error that forced the helicopter to land suddenly, and it was unclear what happened here. But despite the error, it was still working, with Ingenuity continuing its mission. Then more recently, during the Flight 69, this was on December of 2023, it established a new distance record, 706 meters or 2,300 feet, the longest distance it's covered so far. But a little bit after this, during the Flight 71, it once again had a major glitch, a technical problem that basically forced it to terminate its flight. And once again, it's not clear what happened here. And during the most recent flight, Flight 72, even though the helicopter was able to fly successfully, the communication between the rover and the helicopter once again terminated for unknown reasons. It's unclear right now why this happened, but as of January 20, 2024, there seems to be some communication, it's just unclear why it stopped. And so right now we have no idea if it's still going to be working this year, but it's not dead just yet. Okay, no, it's dead now. And so, as the editing Anton mentioned before, the helicopter is officially now basically dead. Okay, not that dead, it's broken. Not the whole thing, but a major part of its blade. As NASA has recently learned by looking at the images received after the 72nd flight. A major chunk of the blade is definitely missing. And this must have happened during the recent flight. Now, there's still communication with the rover, and it still seems to work, it even has power. But because the flight is no longer possible, this is officially the end of the mission, making January 18 the last flight of the helicopter. But considering the fact that it flew 14 times farther and 33 times longer than originally planned, with a total flight time of over 2 hours, that is just absolutely insane. It actually seems to have fared better than any of the t-shirts I produced 2 years ago when the mission just started. But I guess the question is, do we know anything about what happened and how exactly did this break? Well, the short answer right now is no. During the 70-second flight, the helicopter was essentially performing a hop. It rose to about 40 feet or 12 meters in the air and hovered for 5 seconds. But as it was descending, the communication suddenly cut out, and one of the last images revealed this. And so either the blade struck the ground, possibly breaking, or maybe they were just getting really old and it just came off in the process. From the image we can tell that approximately a quarter of the blade is missing. But because the data from this flight was not saved, we're not really going to know exactly what happened. Here's actually one of the last images taken during the previous flight, and this looks absolutely gorgeous. But the thing is, Perseverance is sort of headed in this direction, and so it might be able to snap a shot of the helicopter for the last time in the next few weeks. But it is going to be moving past it, and so after a few months, NASA is going to completely lose all contact with the helicopter, officially ending the mission. But just the fact that it survived so much in the last 2 years is really impressive. It survived dust storms, it survived a Martian winter, it was covered in Martian dust and then wasn't, and it even had a broken sensor that was able to ignore completely. But even after several major problems with computers and software problems, it was doing just fine. And if it wasn't for this broken blade, it's quite likely it would have been going for quite some time. So an absolutely incredible mission that's going to be extremely hard to beat for anyone trying this again using similar designs. But more importantly, all of these flights collected so much data about extraterrestrial helicopters that NASA researchers have now started testing next-generation helicopter blades and have been actively applying all of these lessons to other important helicopter mission that's going to be landing on Titan. And so the Dragonfly mission have been redesigned just a little bit based on the lessons from Mars, with some of the future missions to Mars also very likely featuring more helicopters, with some potentially able to collect all of the samples deposited by Perseverance instead of using a wheeled rover like the ones we're used to. And so basically this beautiful mission potentially completely changed their approach to exploring other planets. It looks like helicopters are surprisingly efficient and seem to be much more effective than a typical rover, not to mention cheap. But what's not cheap is of course a retrieval mission. And this is where we kind of have our first problem. Some of the recent independent investigations discovered that the sample return mission might be just a little bit too expensive. And so unless NASA is able to redesign the mission and make it cheaper, it might not actually happen anytime soon. And so the samples that Perseverance has been collecting and leaving on the surface might stay here for some time. But hopefully, one day in the future, someone is able to recover them. Until then, the surface of Mars is going to be covered with these lightsabers that's going to be lying there collecting dust. But at least for now, that's kind of all I wanted to mention. Let's discuss new updates from our beautiful neighbor Mars, the red planet that keeps surprising us pretty much every single month. And this time I wanted to start with the discoveries from Martian atmosphere, but really with this particular picture. The view of Martian horizon captured by the NASA's Odyssey orbiter showing this very beautiful green glow. And though in this case this is just a picture showing us what the Martian atmosphere physically looks like if you were to orbit around the planet, it directly connects to new studies that confirm that Mars does actually glow in different colors depending on the season. And here we're talking about the phenomenon sometimes referred to as the night glow, the atmospheric phenomenon that seems to be present on pretty much all planets in the solar system. But the colors themselves usually differ because of the process that's involved here. Here, during daytime, the light from the sun splits apart various molecules, producing individual atoms. This is known as photodissociation. These atoms then travel across the planet and will usually end up on the night side, where they basically rebuild themselves into various molecules, in the process releasing light. And so here on Earth, quite a variety of different colors are produced in the process. On planets like Jupiter and Saturn, usually this is in much higher frequencies, so it's normally ultraviolet light, but it turns out that on Mars, it produces green colors. And this is due to the breakup of the CO2 molecules, very often in the upper atmosphere, 40 to 150 kilometers in altitude. But intriguingly, a recent study discovered that there is at least one more glow at much lower altitudes, produced by oxygen. And here this was caused by recombination of oxygen atoms created in the atmosphere during summertime, which actually produces visible light. Light that might resemble something like this. And this surprisingly seems to be concentrated in the polar regions of the red planet, mostly because the atmospheric flows seem to converge in the north and in the south. But depending on the season, the overall luminosity seems to change over time. So sometimes it's brighter in the north, sometimes it's brighter in the south. Intriguingly, a very similar type of a glow is known to exist on Venus and is basically produced in exactly the same way. But on Mars, because there is a lot less atmosphere, it actually allows us to study the overall composition of the atmosphere as well. For example, another unusual emission in the ultraviolet suggested that there is also nitric oxide that seems to produce the glowing effects only visible in the UV light. So this is definitely a very intriguing study, allowing us to learn more about Martian atmosphere. Then we have a few more discoveries from the surface of the planet. And here one of them is actually kind of exciting. This literally shows us the ice map, the water ice map of the entire planet. Although mostly focusing on the northern hemisphere, because that's where most of the discoveries have been made so far. But this doesn't show us ice on the surface, it shows us ice hiding underneath, with a lot of the surprises being in regions we didn't expect, actually surprisingly close to the equator. But more excitingly, this is an interactive map, the link for which you can find in a description. So here, if one day you find yourself in need to plan some kind of a mission to Mars and you need a lot of water, use the map. But for me, the most interesting part of this is how this was discovered and confirmed. Because a lot of this was confirmed by looking at various ice-revealing impacts. Basically, various meteorites exposing the surface and then spewing ice all around the crater. And because there are so many collisions on the surface, this allowed the scientists to determine exactly what's underneath. For some of the craters, by looking at how fast the ice evaporated, they were even able to determine what sort of ice this was, suggesting that it's basically 99% pure water. And because some of these locations are relatively close to the warmer equatorial regions, it presents us with a lot more potential landing sites for any kind of a crewed mission. And so there's definitely a lot of water ice hidden underneath the Martian surface. And speaking of impacts, something else was discovered not so long ago by literally listening to the impacts as they happened and then reading the seismic data from the actual vibrations they produced. This was of course done by the now retired InSight mission, and so for approximately 4 years between 2018 and 2022, it observed 18 quakes produced by various impacts that allowed the scientists to try to figure out what's inside the planet. In other words, they were able to analyze the internal structure of the planet, revealing its layers. And although the initial discoveries suggested that the core of Mars might be a little bit bigger, the recalculations, based on several quakes produced by these meteorites, determined that the core here is approximately 1650 kilometers in radius, but seems to have a somewhat unusual layer of molten rock right above it. A kind of a second liquid layer. And so basically there are two liquid layers inside Mars, the liquid core and the molten rock right above it, which actually would suggest that Mars can still be somewhat geologically active sometimes. And as the scientists were wondering how often, and basically can it actually produce some kind of an earthquake or a new volcano, they got their answer almost right away. Within the same time frame, there was actually a detection of the largest quake ever, something that lasted for about 6 hours, and something that did not resemble a typical meteorite strike. And since all of the other detections also left behind a crater that was discovered later, sometimes even a large crater, in this case, nothing was actually found. This mysterious earthquake did not have an origin from the surface, and since the magnitude for this earthquake was 4.7 on the Richter scale, this suggested the size of the crater to be approximately 300 meters across. Something like this would have been seen almost right away. And so instead, the conclusion here was that Mars is indeed still geologically active, produces earthquakes, but exactly how is currently unknown. It's most likely not in the same way that we have earthquakes on Earth. There are no plate tectonics here, there are no continents, but it could be related to some kind of a stress inside the planet, or something else we don't really understand yet. But this is of course an important discovery, once again for those crewed missions. If we go to Mars, we have to be aware that not only are there meteorite impacts, there are also earthquakes, and dust storms, and no air, also radiation, and most importantly, no fast food or Starbucks coffee. So yeah, I'm definitely not going. But there were some other discoveries from the surface and from just underneath the surface from another mission, specifically the Zhurong mission by China. And here this was the result of ground-penetrating radar discovering something at a depth of about 35 meters underneath. It discovered unusual polygonal structures anywhere from a few centimeters to a few meters across. And here they seem to resemble something we usually see on Earth as well. They resemble this. This is a result of thermal contraction that basically ends up cracking the surface, but then these cracks are then filled with water or possibly ice that's hiding underneath. But because this is seen as sediment and is actually inside the ground, this must have happened a long time ago, possibly billions of years ago, and was very likely buried by some kind of a major cataclysm that happened in this region on Mars, producing this huge amount of sediment on the surface. And so even though this is a sign of water-ice cycle once again, here this also shows us a dramatic change in climate or potentially some kind of a cataclysm that had a huge impact on a lot of soil in the location at low to mid latitudes. So even though Mars used to have water, something major must have happened afterwards in order to change the surface so much and cover it with so much sediment. What exactly happened we obviously don't know, but it's definitely an intriguing new mystery. And lastly, we have this relatively cool video produced by ESA, a video of the region known as Noctis Labyrinthus, a huge formation on Mars that basically looks like a bunch of valleys and is located between a really large canyon known as the Grand Canyon or Valles Marineris and the tallest volcano in the solar system, Olympus Mons. But in this case, Noctis Labyrinthus is actually a really intriguing system that stretches for approximately 1200 kilometers, I guess around 800 miles. And what you're seeing here is a simulation or a visualization of what Mars Express would physically see with its camera and the pictures that it usually produces as a result. And a lot of these canyons have a name. They're known as graben. It's basically crust that suddenly fell into the ground compared to the surroundings that remain on the same level. But because of the size of this, the question is, what exactly produced this? With the answer being the extreme activity, geological activity on Mars. Here's actually what this region looks like if you were to look at it from farther away. And it's basically a result of the activity from this enormous volcano you see right there and from its partners nearby. As a lot of this volcanism started, it was so intense that it actually caused huge areas of Martian crust to start arching upwards and become stretched in the process. And this enormous stress on the Martian surface started to produce a lot of faulting along this entire region, with large chunks of the surface falling underneath and forming various canyons and valleys, some as wide as 30 kilometers in width. And so basically pretty much all of this is a result of extreme Martian volcanism, so powerful and so dramatic that it kind of reshaped the surface of Mars, making it twist and stretch in a certain direction. And this video helps us visualize everything. Hello InfoPerson, this is Anton, and it's time for another update in regards to our neighbor, Mars. Because once again we have some really exciting pictures coming from the surface of the red planet, and even at least one video, as well as a few discoveries from various missions. Although I guess let's start with some of the more unusual pictures from the last few months. The unusual feature on the surface of Mars known as the brain terrain. Actually because it kind of resembles the human brain. But these are features on the surface of Mars, mostly located in mid-latitudes, in the location where the northern plain meets the southern highland. And it seems to occur inside craters, valleys, and a lot of other ice-rich locations, suggesting that this is definitely something created by the ice water. The problem is that nobody actually knows exactly how this is made because it seems to be unique to Mars. It could be formed by the frozen water underneath and possibly be a result of sublimation, but it's actually completely unknown. Although some scientists are trying to solve this by finding potentially similar features right here on planet Earth. Here's an example from the Arctic, and to some extent it does maybe look very similar, but not exactly the same. The features on planet Earth are definitely different and are not as advanced as the ones on Mars. And so exactly what's happening here, and exactly how this is formed, is not going to be known for some time. Definitely looks cool though. And speaking of looking cool, once again we have a video of a Martian whirlwind, or a Martian dust devil. Now these have obviously been seen before, but it's always fun to find more. And this is actually a really big feature, at least 200 feet or 60 meters across, and at least 1.2 miles or 2 kilometers high. But because it's so far away, it does appear kind of small. And though obviously these also exist on Earth as well, on Mars they're generally a little bit bigger and will usually look a little bit more dramatic, even though they don't actually exert as much pressure. Nevertheless, cool stuff. And more cool stuff was a picture taken by the Perseverance. A picture you see right here, a Martian sunset. And though it might not look spectacular, it does become very spectacular once you compare it to the one right here on planet Earth. Here's actually a really cool picture created by NASA with the title 2 Worlds, 1 Sun. And that's because the sunset on Mars will always be blue in color compared to the red-orange sunsets here on Earth. And this is of course a result of the interaction between the Sun itself and the atmosphere of the two planets. The sunset has to go through a relatively thick layer of oxygen, nitrogen, and quite a lot of particulates in the atmosphere, which basically filters out blue light, leaving the oranges and the reds mostly untouched. But on a red planet, the atmosphere is much thinner and is also predominantly CO2, yet also contains large amounts of dust, including the dust of iron-rich particles, which tends to have almost the opposite effect. It seems to scatter low-frequency red light, yet leaves the blue light almost completely untouched, which also makes all of the light near the Sun appear generally blue. You can see this as a very large halo around the Sun. But intriguingly, the rest of the sky is usually yellow to orange, because the red light gets scattered across the rest of the sky, to some extent also adding a little bit of redness to the already red planet. But these bluish colors can persist even several hours after the sunset, which means that at night you actually get to see clouds in the night skies as they reflect some of this light. Quite a lot of analysis of various clouds on Mars usually take place at this time. And so basically the clouds to some extent almost appear like they're glowing, but glowing with a blue light. So quite an impressive image. But it becomes more impressive when you see things side by side. At the same time, we have quite a few images showing us the terrain on Mars, which once again seems to confirm the same thing about Martian history. It very likely used to be wet here, and it also most likely contained seasons. With all of this recently detected by observing some of the new images from the Curiosity rover and detecting certain patterns which appear to be the result of various mud cracks, similar to the ones we find on planet Earth, but in this case a result of something that forms over many different seasons, with some of the newer cracks even appearing to have sulfates, which were very likely deposited much later. And so here this is actually a sign of different water levels changing with time, and some kind of a lake very likely rising and falling, creating these formations. In other words, a direct confirmation of some kind of a dry, wet season period, but something that existed on Mars billions of years ago. And these constantly changing conditions most likely encouraged a lot of chemical reactions inside this unusual clay, which we know on Earth very likely led to the formation of very complex organic chemistry, including DNA precursors. So definitely quite an important discovery. With other signs of seasonality or changing conditions detected from a slightly different region that basically shows us the evidence of various ancient glaciers. Glaciers that transform the land that you see right here and almost directly resemble similar features on planet Earth. Basically this is a sign of retreating ice flows during some kind of an interglacial period. And in this case we're basically seeing these ancient glaciers picking up rocks and soil, carrying them elsewhere, and then depositing them in a different location. It's almost impossible to explain this in any other way. And so these observations from the Martian surface almost definitively tell us that this planet had seasons, and it also had quite a lot of glacial activity. This is also from the mid-latitudes, so this was not just in the North or South Pole. And though these discoveries might suggest that life could have existed here, there's one discovery that was really surprising to everyone, and to some extent almost suggests the opposite, or at least presents Mars as still an extremely different type of a planet. This relatively recent study you can find in the description performed an extremely thorough analysis of various minerals on Mars and compared them to minerals on Earth. Here on Earth, minerals are pretty much everything. They're obviously responsible for complex organic chemistry, but quite a lot of them actually have been created by life. And here on Earth, nearly 6,000 different minerals are known to exist. Many of them were formed in the beginning of the planet, but quite a few of them developed later on, especially through various chemical interactions with the constantly changing planet, but also with a lot of different types of life. There is of course a direct correlation between mineral complexity and the presence of complex life on the planet, or at least for planet Earth. But though 6,000 are known on planet Earth, after 50 years of studies, only 161 minerals have been identified coming from the surface of Mars. Now obviously there might be more, but 160 versus 6,000 is a huge difference. Because first of all, this kind of suggests that Mars was most likely not nearly as complex geologically as planet Earth. It also suggests that there are probably a lot of different pathways for the mineral formation that seem to be absent on the red planet. This planet isn't, and even wasn't, advanced enough to produce the complexity similar to planet Earth. At the same time, the lack of plate tectonics and very likely active geological cycle prevented the formation and development of a lot of other minerals as well. But I guess more importantly, the lack of mineral complexity on Mars also to some extent implies that maybe life never really existed here. It's obviously very early to tell, but if Mars does not have the complexity similar to planet Earth, it's extremely unlikely to have ever had life as well. Here on Earth, life and complexity of minerals are directly interconnected. And so yeah, at least for now, maybe a somewhat concerning discovery in regards to potential existence of life on the red planet. But we might be able to find out if there is life if we actually organize some kind of a crewed mission here. And it just so happens that one of the missions on Perseverance was this really cool cube-like instrument that you see right here, known as MOXIE. And MOXIE's main purpose was to test if we can actually produce oxygen directly from the CO2 on Mars. And while it's official that it seems to work really well, over the period of several years, the instrument was able to produce 12 grams of oxygen per hour with approximately 98% purity, essentially using an electrochemical process where the oxygen is separated from CO2 and is then combined with another oxygen. And more importantly, it seems to work in pretty much all conditions throughout the entire Martian year. Which means that by bringing a much larger version of this, not only will the astronauts will have something to breathe, they'll also be able to produce their own fuel by using nothing but Martian atmosphere. Assuming, of course, the mission to Mars happens at some point in the future. There is once again a bit of a snag here. Some of the recent financial reports suggested that even trying to retrieve samples from Mars is going to cost quite a lot, possibly upwards of $11 billion. That's of course more expensive than the James Webb Space Telescope that took several decades to develop. And so at the moment it's unclear if these samples collected by the Perseverance are going to be collected in the next decade. I mean, they're supposed to be collected, but it just seems to be ridiculously expensive. Which is actually why some of the scientists started to think about, okay, maybe we can actually collaborate with someone on this. And it just so happens that the first country that obviously came to mind was, China. Turns out that things are really complicated. Even though China is also planning a mission to Mars around the same time, with the main purpose of sample retrieval, and even though this would dramatically reduce the costs if two countries collaborated, turns out that because of something known as the Wolf Amendment passed in 2011, it is basically completely illegal for anyone from NASA to collaborate or technically even talk to anyone from the Chinese Space Agency. Strangely enough, they're not even allowed to attend different science conferences that might have anything to do with NASA. And though China is obviously not in the best terms with the US right now, as far as I know, NASA is still collaborating with Russia, and that by itself is kind of hypocritical. Also, as far as I know, almost every NASA scientist would like this rescinded, and so quite a lot of NASA scientists have actually been pushing to try to remove this amendment because it's really not helping anyone. By being able to collaborate with another country, the joint mission to planet Mars would make things so much faster and so much more efficient. And we obviously know from the experience with the International Space Station that these collaborations do end up producing something absolutely incredible. So yeah. But at least for now, it looks like US is going to be on its own and China is going to do its own thing as well. Things might change by 2030, but at least for now, we're not really sure. Either way though, because of the costs, it's not clear if the retrieval mission will ever happen. And so all of these samples might actually be staying on the surface for quite some time. But I'm sure someone will figure something out, because there are still almost 10 years before this mission has to be officially launched. Other than that though, well, that's pretty much all I wanted to mention about the red planet and some of the new discoveries coming from the surface. When it comes to our neighbor Mars, one of the major questions that scientists have been trying to answer for many decades now is whether life still exists on the surface of this unusual planet. And though in the last few years, a lot of science pointed at habitable conditions and maybe some life existing here because of a lot of organic molecules and liquid water, the bigger question here is, does it still exist today? And though in the last few decades, based on a lot of different rovers and a lot of different exploratory missions, nothing major have been so far discovered, even today there is actually a bit of a controversy in regards to the first mission that looked for life on Mars. The iconic Viking 1 and Viking 2 landers that back in 1976 performed very specific biological experiments right on the surface of Mars, and that was their main mission, looking for biosignatures. And although the overall consensus so far is that nothing was actually found here and the results were negative, in reality that is not entirely true. One of the experiments had an unusual positive result that was mostly ignored at first. And ignored because back then, in the 70s, we didn't really know Mars as we know it today. And so because of this, there are several scientists out there that argue quite the opposite. They argue that maybe those samples from Mars did contain life, but because of our misunderstanding of biology here, some of the experimental procedures unfortunately ended up killing this life instead of helping us discover it. And so, hello wonderful person, this is Anton, and let's talk about this very unusual controversy, or I guess disagreement, in regards to these Viking lander biological experiments and the results discovered in the 70s. Specifically focusing on several papers from some of the scientists that believe that based on what we learned from places like the Atacama Desert, with the extremophile bacteria living there in somewhat similar conditions to Mars, there is actually a high chance that something similar was discovered on Mars in the 70s, but was most likely killed during the experimental procedure. And so let's discuss the details. First of all, both Viking probes carried out 4 experiments on the surface of Mars. The first one was what's known as gas chromatography. This is essentially meant to establish the molecular weight of different types of gas inside the sample. The second one was gas exchange. Here the idea is to introduce various gases in order to see if anything is metabolizing the Martian samples. The third one is labeled release, where the scientists introduce radioactive carbon to see if it actually creates radioactive carbon dioxide or any other metabolite. In other words, just to see if something is actually breathing that carbon or changing it in any way. And the last experiment was pyrolytic release that used light and water in order to see if there was any photosynthesis happening in the samples. Basically here this was a fixation of carbon dioxide that was already marked with radioactive isotopes. And while 3 out of 4 experiments were negative, nothing was discovered, nothing indicating life. But one of the experiments had strangely confusing results. Actually, both labeled release and pyrolytic release experiments produced numbers that were basically suggesting maybe there was life. There was a small change in concentration of certain gases that was hinting on some kind of a reaction involving metabolism. But the other experiment, the one measuring the weight of molecules, discovered that a lot of the organics here were chlorinated. Or in other words, it contained chlorine. And so the overall conclusion was that maybe this was just a type of contamination from various sterilizing chlorine-based cleaning products that were used on the Viking probes before they left for Mars. And so in the end, these results were confirmed to be negative overall. Contamination of chlorine, lack of organic molecules, and thus most likely lack of organic life. But the problem with that reasoning today is that since then we've discovered that life actually finds a way. Yeah, Jurassic Park. Not only did we learn that certain life uses chlorinated organics in a lot of different environments, we've also discovered life surviving in a lot of extreme environments on planet Earth. We now refer to them as extremophiles. And specifically, certain bacteria love living in very salty environments, or even chlorinated environments, where they can actually survive with practically no water. And just last year, a lot of these very similar chlorinated organic molecules have officially been confirmed by Perseverance inside the Jezero crater. So explaining those original results as contamination doesn't make sense anymore. These were actually chlorinated organics, which seem to definitely exist on Mars. The problem is that we don't know if they're biological or non-biological, because here on Earth they can be produced either way. Nevertheless, there has been that speculation for many years if maybe all of these results from the Viking probes were actually sign of life after all. With the main premise being really simple. Back in the 70s, the scientists used the experiments assuming that the life going to be very similar to the one that we knew about. Organic, like in water, or basically similar to bacteria on Earth, and very likely existing in liquid environments. They could not imagine life surviving in super dry conditions, with maybe just a little bit of salt or presence of chlorine here and there. Yet in the last couple of decades, scientists working in Chile's Atacama Desert discovered incredible bacteria living here and surviving despite all odds. For example, in this paper from 2016, scientists found microbes living entirely inside rocks of salt and surviving without any water using a process known as hygroscopicity, an unusual process where certain types of salts tend to attract water molecules directly inside of them because of relative humidity in the air. And so by living inside these rocks, those microbes do not need any water whatsoever because the water molecules are able to enter through moisture in the air, and just a little bit of moisture is enough for them to survive. And so these very strange salt rock bacteria have been surviving on Earth for billions of years. And so if Earth, why not Mars? On top of this, because many of these bacteria are used to very dry conditions, when the Viking probe introduced water to the experiment, it might have actually drowned the bacteria, killing them in the process, instead of helping them replicate. Most of the Viking experiments involved applying water to the soil sample, but the pyrolytic release experiment that had positive results was conducted in dry conditions. And so maybe there's a correlation here because dry conditions produced signs of life, yet liquid conditions seem to produce nothing. And the location where the Viking probes landed on Mars is known to contain quite a lot of perchlorates in the soil, which act very similar to these salty rocks on Earth. Moreover, a lot of the observations on Mars revealed that there was actually fog, suggesting that this location had very high humidity. Once again, not so different from Atacama Desert. And so because of these somewhat unusual experimental results, where there were actually signs of life when there was no water present in presence of chlorinated organics, several scientists today are strongly convinced that we found life on Mars back in the 70s, but accidentally killed it, because some of the experiments involved too much water. With the main assumption being that bacteria living here potentially uses a lot of hydrogen peroxides, a lot of perchlorates, and potentially chlorinated organics in order to absorb moisture from the air and to survive in the same way that the bacteria survives in Atacama Desert. And actually by having some of these elements inside the cell, it would even prevent the cell from freezing or prevent the formation of crystals during very cold winters. But at least for now, this is just an assumption and just a hypothesis. A hypothesis that's based on reinterpretation of older results. We still have no idea exactly what the Viking discovered, if anything, with the major consensus being that maybe these perchlorates were just producing natural chemical reactions, resulting in various gases that were produced as a result. So basically it could have been just a regular chemical reaction. But the actual evidence for life, as opposed to against life, is growing stronger and stronger. For example, just a couple of days ago, there was another discovery coming from Perseverance, finding a tremendous amount of organic molecules, with many of them just being a little bit too complex, and maybe even produced by ancient life. Or maybe not so ancient after all. But here's the problem. None of the modern rovers on Mars right now contain necessary equipment to perform any of these experiments in order to once and for all confirm life. But as you probably know, Perseverance has been collecting samples and slowly depositing them on the surface, and some of these samples could maybe contain the exact evidence that we need. And so the future sample return mission might be that chance for us to finally confirm the existence of life on Mars. Not ancient life, life right now. Or better even, maybe we can plan another mission similar to Viking, but using modern equipment and all of the modern understanding about extremophile life. A new dedicated mission to look for signs of life right now inside Martian rocks. Which is actually the point that the scientists behind all of these studies are trying to make. They're really hoping to have another dedicated mission that's going to look for life on Mars, with specific biological experiments designed to uncover extremophiles living in conditions similar to extreme deserts on Earth, something that we can actually test in Atacama Desert by trying to find extremophiles there using similar instruments. But at least for now, nothing like this is planned by anyone, and we don't really know if we're going to have a mission to Mars dedicated to life for at least a decade. And so our only hope is that sample return mission planned for the next 10 years or so. And so until the mission launches, or until we actually get some other results from somewhere else, it's just going to remain a hypothesis, but a hypothesis that needs to be explored further. For all we know, maybe the scientists here are correct, and maybe the life was discovered back in the 70s, but accidentally killed because the experiments back then did not actually know much about the life on Earth. Oh look, we're on Mars! Kind of. Hello wonderful person, this is Anton, and normally I like to start these updates with some kind of a new strange picture coming from the surface of the red planet. And normally it's a picture of some strange rock. Here is the rock of the day. A rock that seems to contain almost like spine-like structures. Now obviously this could be a sign of past life, but right now the scientist who posted this, Nathalie Cabral, believes that this is most likely the signs of an unusual type of erosion that caused certain types of ripples inside the rock to eventually erode due to various interactions with the Martian wind. Although of all possible rocks found here, this is definitely the one we should be collecting samples from. I don't think it's going to be happening just yet, but hopefully in the future. And so in this video, we're going to be discussing some of these recent updates coming from the red planet, some of them somewhat unusual and intriguing, some somewhat difficult to explain, but also some potentially heartbreaking as well. But let's really start with the biggest discovery, the one in regards to the rotation of planet Mars. Something really strange was recently discovered that nobody expected. Something that's coming from the older data from the now cancelled InSight mission. This mission was absolutely incredible for measuring extremely accurate observations coming from within Mars, and during its time on Mars was able to discover a lot of really cool things about the Martian structure. Here, by listening to various Marsquakes, over time it was able to discover the overall internal structure of the red planet. We've actually discussed some of these discoveries something like a year ago, and you can find that video in the description, with one surprise being the Martian core, which seems to be actually bigger and potentially somewhat one-sided, but the most recent surprise discovery was actually a result of data transmission that happened over several years. During its time on Mars, InSight mission was obviously busy transmitting all of this data back to Earth. And during the radio communication between InSight and the Deep Space Network here on Earth, a lot of these radio signals allowed scientists to search for tiny variations of frequency as the signals were transmitted from Mars. And turns out some of these signals were slightly shifted in frequency. This is the concept known as the redshift and the blueshift. But the only reason this was happening was because of the rotation of Mars. The actual frequencies were not always the same. They changed a little bit over the period of about 900 Martian days, which implied a tiny acceleration on the Martian surface. Or just to rephrase this, Martian rotation was increasing in speed. It seemed to be spinning slightly faster than the first signals from just a few years back. But the actual amount is of course minuscule. Approximately 4 milliarc-seconds every year. So basically the Martian day here is shortened by a fraction of a millisecond. Something that we know happens on Earth as well. But our planet has an obvious culprit, the Moon. And apart from the Moon, even the distribution of water on the surface, including the ice caps, tend to influence the rotation just a little bit. But what exactly is doing this to Mars? Mars doesn't have oceans, and Mars doesn't have powerful moons. Which is essentially this new mystery from the red planet. What is causing the acceleration over time? There is obviously no definitive answer just yet, but at the moment, scientists believe that it's probably because of the polar ice caps, which do have similar effects on planet Earth. Alternatively, it's maybe because of something inside Mars, such as the interaction of mantle with the inner core. And because it's already been discovered that the core here doesn't have density distributed equally, maybe there is an unusual motion inside Mars that Earth does not have. Anyway, it's basically a new mystery. No answer just yet. You can read more about this in a paper in the description. Here's another really strange picture from the surface of Mars. This time, it's not a rock, but instead this is signs of ancient volcanism. And the thing about Mars is that it does have a tremendous number of very unusual, very strange volcanoes. Now, this particular formation is very close to one of the larger volcanoes known as the Ascraeus Mons, the most prominent of several volcanoes in the Tarsus region. And this little guy measures at approximately 18 kilometers in height. But what's really strange about the volcano is that patch of collapsed terrain that looks like snakes. Now these are really large snakes, approximately 70 kilometers across. But in a nutshell, these are lava tubes and various types of fissures that we often see on Earth as well. But these particular structures are also probably formed as a result of a collapse. But what exactly caused the collapse is obviously unknown. Nevertheless, there are quite a lot of these structures around this volcano, with the entire area around the volcano containing these unusual snake-like formations. Now obviously we don't have anything like this on planet Earth, and so the actual origin story here is going to be unknown for a very long time, but this seems to be pretty common on Mars. But when it comes to volcanoes, a much more interesting discovery comes from the biggest volcano in the entire solar system. Actually, this is the biggest mountain in the solar system, the famous Olympus Mons, 25 kilometers in height and comparable in size to the country of Poland, much bigger than anything on Earth. And there was actually a really impressive study released not so long ago that suggested that unusual formations surrounding Olympus Mons were very likely formed by lava interacting with liquid water. In essence, suggesting that this was not just the largest volcano in the solar system, this was the largest island volcano. And it's really the observations from the edges of the volcano that implied there was interaction with water. If correct though, all of this would be happening billions of years ago, possibly at least 3.5 billion years ago. This is a really ancient volcano. But it basically suggests that Mars back then most likely possessed an ocean that was at least 1.5 kilometers in depth, possibly even deeper depending on the location. Although trying to figure out exactly what happened here and trying to actually see if these rocks were formed in liquid water would require an on-site geological investigation. That's probably not happening anytime soon. We also had some unusual pictures of different craters. Mars is also very famous for so many different strange craters on the surface that stayed here for billions of years. This one here looks like a foot, but it was essentially formed because of an asteroid that most likely collided with Mars at a large angle. Here's another one that probably was created in a very similar way. Now there are quite a lot of these unusual craters on Mars, but what's even stranger is actually the result of these collisions that we then discover on planet Earth. As we've discussed in a lot of previous videos, quite a lot of meteorites that we discover on our own planet seem to come from Mars. This is the famous meteorite known as the Black Beauty. And the question has always been, why so many? Is Mars just really good at losing rocks over time? And so to work this out, scientists actually performed a really intriguing experiment. They took a bunch of rocks similar to Martian rocks and shot them out of a powerful blast gun simulating impacts on Mars. And the main goal was really simple. Try to create rocks similar to Martian asteroids and try to figure out what kind of an impact could potentially create them. With the main result being that apparently you don't need a powerful asteroid to suddenly eject a lot of Martian rocks from the surface with similar structures to what we find on planet Earth, suggesting that even ejection from small impacts is most likely extremely common. Or basically that the red planet is just really good at losing rocks from the surface every time any impact occurs. Possibly due to low atmosphere and possibly due to low gravity. But the fact that they actually used an experiment to show this is already quite impressive. And speaking of rocks, we also have some really cool pictures from Perseverance that recently captured this beautiful shot, while also collecting some samples, of a very strange area with distinctly colored rocks. And here the only explanation is that these are rocks that were moved by an ancient river, and possibly a fast-moving ancient river that was able to deposit these rocks in a certain way. In other words, it's an indirect sign that the water used to flow here a long time ago. But at the same time, while Perseverance was collecting samples, one of the geochemical experiments, using instrument known as Sherlock, discovered unusual signs of very complex organic molecules, with a study in a description describing this in more detail. But discovering organic molecules on the surface is not really a big deal. There are quite a lot of natural geological processes that can generally create organic molecules as well. The mystery here was actually in regards to something else. First, a lot of these molecules seem to be linked to various aquatic processes, or basically liquid water. But second, many of these diverse aromatic molecules seem to actually persist on the surface of Mars, even though technically they should be destroyed. This planet is not very hospitable to complex chemistry because of the interaction with various cosmic radiation and even emissions from the sun. Yet somehow these organic molecules are still able to survive on the surface. And so in that sense, it could actually be maybe the sign of potential life. Either life that existed here not so long ago, or maybe even a life that still exists here today. Now we'll actually be discussing this particular topic in a separate video in more detail, but at least for now this is a really intriguing discovery. In essence, it indicates that for some reason, quite a lot of complex organic molecules exist on the surface and survive despite difficult conditions, either because they're being replenished by something, or for other reasons we don't understand. But as I mentioned, this mission has already collected one of the samples, that sort of looks like this, that's going to be left on the surface for the retrieval mission to collect it afterwards. And so that's where we have our first bad news. The recent recommendation from the Senate has hinted on a potential cancellation of a mission unless NASA finds a way to stay on the budget. And this by itself does not sound very good. It sort of suggests that NASA has a very high chance right now to maybe have this entire mission scrapped in the next few years. And that will be absolutely devastating because quite a lot depends on this particular mission, and so many different samples have already been left on the surface. Instead, what the Senate wants to focus on is the Artemis mission, with the main point being the moon. And that's unfortunately the reality of modern space program. It's technically been losing money every single year, with the overall cuts increasing in the last decade. You can see here that the budget was practically unlimited during the moon race, and it was also slightly increased during the early 90s, but ever since then it was continuously dropping every year. Now technically in numbers it's increasing, but if you compare this to the total percentage of the federal budget, it's been basically below 0.5% for the past few years, with the new budget very likely being the lowest yet. Now chances are NASA is actually going to find a way around this and finds a way to cut some costs somewhere, so this mission is probably not going to get cancelled, but it's still kind of sad to hear that it is a possibility. Anyway, let's hope that the Martian mission does not stop here. But one of the last things I wanted to talk about is of course our beautiful little helicopter that also seems to be on my t-shirt right here that, you can maybe buy in the description below. You don't have to. It does support the channel, but you don't have to. Anyway, recently NASA released a video celebrating 50 flights. It's now conducted 54 flights, but the 53rd flight conducted on July 22nd was supposed to last 136 seconds, but only lasted 74 seconds, with the helicopter landing after some sort of an error that was reported on board. And so the recent flight number 54 was really meant to test what's actually happening here and to try to find out if the error might have been fixed. Now a similar error did actually occur approximately 2 years ago, and it was pretty quickly fixed using a software patch, but at the moment it's unclear what caused the new error. Right now the engineers behind the mission think that it's maybe because of the navigational camera being out of sync with inertial measurements that resulted from the helicopter sitting on the surface for several months. But exactly what's happening here and how it's going to be fixed, we're only going to find out about in the next few weeks. Either way though, the mission is still not cancelled and is still going pretty strong. But at least for now, these are some of the major updates about Mars and some of the major discoveries. Hello wonderful person, this is Anton, and today we're going to be discussing some of the new updates and some of the new discoveries coming from our red neighbor, Mars. Because as always, we have some major scientific findings coming from this beautiful red planet. But to start, let's take a look at something that's not particularly scientific or particularly exciting, but something that does look kinda cool. A donut rock, recently discovered by the Perseverance rover, with the one big question being, what exactly created the hole? Now unusual rocks are very common on Mars, and you can actually find some videos in the description talking about previous discoveries, but in this case the shape in the middle is very likely a result of long-term erosion that most likely broke the inner pieces, which you can now see lying around surrounding the larger structure, with the rock itself almost certainly being a relatively old meteorite. Once again, very common on the surface. Here's what it looks like with the slightly different coloration, revealing a slightly different composition. But I think this image is a little bit more intriguing. This shows us Mars like we've never seen it before. This is Mars in the ultraviolet. And it's actually two different pictures taken months apart, actually showing us the seasonal changes on the planet. These were taken by the Mars Atmosphere and Volatile Evolution probe, also known as MAVEN, that's orbiting the planet observing various atmospheric processes. And what it actually allows us to see in the ultraviolet is the interaction of different gases in the thin Martian atmosphere, including, and this is actually really cool, Martian Aurora, only visible in the UV light. But unlike Aurora on Earth, the ones on Mars are produced in an entirely different way, with the process being a little bit more complex. The video in the description describes it in more detail. But the purple stuff that you see here, it's actually ozone, with various other hazes, or various types of gases, appearing in white or blue. And so this first image from July of 2022 shows us the southern hemisphere when it was summertime. Not much going on here. But then by early 2023, we suddenly observe a lot of seasonal changes that seem to produce a lot of white clouds, especially in the northern hemisphere. But more excitingly, a huge buildup of ozone. Nobody is certain why yet, but that's what seems to happen on the planet every time there is a major seasonal change. We'll hopefully get to learn more about this in some of the future studies. On top of this, we also got to learn a little bit more about the Martian crust and a lot of other surface processes. Turns out that the crust here is somewhat different from planet Earth. All of this data was collected by the InSight probe that accidentally heard a relatively powerful Marsquake, allowing it to reveal a lot of data from inside the planet. And so Mars, which obviously has just one thick plate compared to Earth that has plate tectonics, seems to have a much thicker crust. On average, it seems to be anywhere between 42 and 56 kilometers, and that's basically almost double of Earth, where it's usually anywhere from 21 to 27 kilometers. And even thicker than the crust on the Moon, where it's believed to be about 34 to 43 kilometers in thickness. But on Mars, it also seems to differ quite a lot depending on where you look. The thinnest crust is around what's known as Isidis Impact Basin, and here it's only about 10 kilometers. This area was previously explored by the Beagle rover back in 2003. Here, the explanation is obviously that it's a crater, with the impact very likely creating a much thinner crust. But the thickest region is right here. This is the region known as Tharsis, and here it's over 90 kilometers thick, which is way more than anything on Earth. And more intriguingly, and more importantly, there's a huge difference between the north and the south. This is actually something that we've known for a very long time, but as you can see from this image, there's a definite dichotomy in terms of the total thickness of crust. It's as if this planet was created from two separate pieces. Now previously this was believed to be part of some kind of a major collision a long time ago, but even today it's not entirely clear why this region looks different. This was also very likely an ancient ocean, but once again, still a little bit mysterious. Although I'm sure we'll learn more about this as we get more data from various rovers and from various orbiters. Here's actually another really intriguing picture that was recently released by one of the orbiters, in essence showing us ancient lava flows and ancient lava tubes that were most likely created by some kind of a collapsed terrain billions of years ago. Here this is approximately 70 kilometers across. We also have some other mysterious anomalies recently detected by several different rovers and several orbiters. In this case, it's in regards to what the scientists now refer to as magnetic pockets. Turns out that both rovers and orbiters seem to get different results when they measure magnetosphere or magnetic field. The Chinese Zhurong rover, for some reason, was not detecting a very strong magnetosphere, even though several Martian orbiters were seeing something very strong in a location not so far away. Intriguingly, the InSight probe, that was active up until relatively recently, has also detected magnetic field that was much stronger than originally believed, but the orbital measurements, especially in the region nearby, were once again different. With the implication being that Mars seems to have these unusual pockets of magnetosphere, with other regions being demagnetized over time, but some regions staying magnetic even today. The actual field here is actually kind of weak, something like 1.5 microtesla at its maximum, or about 30 times lower than the average field on Earth, but that was at the maximum. The average field was about 10 times lower than that, or about 1/300th of what we have on planet Earth. But this does seem to differ quite a lot, with certain locations being way more magnetized than others. And so if this is what the map of Mars kind of looks like, here's roughly what the magnetic fields seem to be like. Some locations are very magnetized, some are completely demagnetized. But exactly why this is so is obviously not currently known. Here's another beautiful video of Martian dunes inside one of the Martian craters that was taken by one of the orbiters. And by itself this is a beautiful image showing us the planet like we've never really seen it before. Now this crater is actually really exciting. It's known as Matara crater, approximately 50 kilometers across. And just like so many other unusual Martian craters, it seems to contain a huge amount of sand dunes right in the middle of the structure. I think this one here is the most famous, the Victoria crater. The picture that was also taken by the Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter. The scientists would really love to explore these dunes, but we don't really have a very good record with Martian rovers in sand. For example, the Martian Spirit rover eventually got stuck in the sand in 2010, and that's how its mission was ended. But these regions are really exciting for many reasons. Because, for one, there seem to be actually signs of ancient water flowing across the dunes. As a matter of fact, some of these locations seem to resemble various gullies located in places like Antarctica, which are very often caused by melting glaciers. And so various scientific teams would really love to find out if it actually is from flowing water, or if it's something entirely different. And if these were produced by water, it might have happened approximately 600,000 years ago, and could have been a result of a major climatic change on the planet. One of the studies recently explored this, discovering that it's definitely possible if the planet itself dramatically changed its tilt, closer to about 35 degrees. And if the planet did change its tilt dramatically, it would change the overall density of atmosphere, it would also change the temperature, and would even cause certain locations to heat up above the freezing point of water. At least certain types of salty water, assuming that there were some deposits somewhere. And this would be of course very similar to what happens on Earth, with the concept of Milankovitch cycles, but for Earth, these changes are not as dramatic because we have something that stabilizes everything. Our moon. It prevents the Earth from wobbling too much, and it prevents the Milankovitch cycles from getting out of control. But on Mars, it could actually flip quite a lot, thus changing the atmospheric conditions and the climate quite dramatically once in a while. Something that was recently simulated, and something the scientists believe might have happened possibly a few 100,000 years ago. And there's actually even more proof of this coming from a slightly different study. This one studied the orientation of dunes. And what the scientists did here is pretty clever. They looked at the orientation of dunes and the overall age of the dunes in various locations on Mars. Dunes are obviously formed by the action of the wind, with the wind in this case usually having a generally similar direction. But turns out that something happened on Mars approximately 400,000 years ago, which dramatically shifted the direction of the wind. The orientation of dunes seems to have changed by approximately 70 degrees, which to the scientists behind this paper implies a dramatic change in climate. Once again, very likely due to the axial tilt of Mars. Seasonal change cannot explain this entirely. Now once again, this is very similar to what we expect from Milankovitch cycles, but in this case they're just way more extreme than anything on Earth. And that's of course because Martian moons are just way smaller, and thus cannot really affect Mars from flipping completely or from having a lot of axial tilt. But exactly how Milankovitch cycles would work on Mars has never really been studied in detail. Nevertheless, the implication here is that once in a while, the Martian climate changes dramatically and can potentially even become just a little bit more Earth-like, very likely even producing liquid water and very likely dramatically changing the overall density of the atmosphere. How or why, still unknown. But we'll be definitely discussing some of this once someone figures this out. And then, last but not least, is the discovery coming from the Perseverance in regards to the composition of various rocks that it already analyzed so far. This was the famous one, the Maas rock. And the discovery here is of a lot of different complex organic molecules. Something that everyone was very excited to find, but something that currently does not make sense. Mostly because even though the rocks are actually quite close to one another, they do seem to have a very different number, type, and concentration of various organic molecules that were discovered so far. Now we don't really know exactly what molecules they are, but they all seem to have complex carbon chemistry, and many show signs of being created around liquid water. And so the discovery of hydrocarbons on Mars, and specifically ones created around liquid water, is definitely very exciting. It of course suggests that the organic matter here could be all over the place. But you might want to check out one of the videos I made about Antarctica that kind of suggests discovering actual life here would be extremely challenging. Current instruments are just not good enough to find direct signs of life. Nevertheless, we might hear more about this in the next few months. Hello InfoPerson, this is Anton, and today we're going to be discussing some new exciting discoveries coming from planet Mars. And in this case, we're actually going to be discussing several major discoveries from the last few months, including major updates about the Martian helicopter. The Ingenuity helicopter, that just so happens is also on the t-shirt I'm wearing right now. By the way, you can buy one of these in the description below. Okay, a bit of a self-promotion. Anyway, the reason we're actually talking about Mars is because this has now completed its 50th flight. And 50 flights is a lot of flights. It's 10 times more than was expected before this mission was even launched. And even though technically this was just a demonstration of technology, allowing the scientists to finally prove that you can technically conduct powered flight on planets other than planet Earth, in the process, the success from this mission already led to some major changes in future missions as well, including the retrieval mission that's going to be collecting samples dropped by the Perseverance rover, that's going to use a wheeled helicopter to collect all of these tubes, place them into a launching platform, which will then use a rocket to launch them back to planet Earth. Although all of this is going to be happening sometime in the next 10 years. And so this 50th flight is a really big achievement. With a total flight time of almost 90 minutes, the total distance flown being approximately 11.5 kilometers, and the highest altitude being 18 meters. And the site in the description also even provides some of the pictures you can see from every flight, including that recent flight that occurred on April 13th of 2023. In this case, it's actually an image from Perseverance, and it's an image of a rock. Yep, another rock. These are very common on Mars. But just the fact that this mission survived for over 2 years, conducted 50 flights, and is still going pretty strong, honestly is just absolutely ridiculous. At this point, the scientists have even ran out of alphabet to name various landing strips, like the ones you see right here. Now they are actually using the Greek alphabet, with the 50th location now being known as Airfield Mu. And after a few landings, even the Greek alphabet is no longer going to be enough. I'm kinda curious what they're going to use next. But I guess it's just unbelievable that it's been 2 years now, and both the rover and the helicopter are doing so well. So well, as a matter of fact, that even though this was one of the first selfies, here's one of the latest ones, in this case, with one of the samples that was recently dropped. And to celebrate this, some of the members in the NASA team even made this beautiful time-lapse you see right here, that essentially shows us the 2 years of progress as the rover explored the surface. So super exciting stuff. But there's also obviously some science that has already been done from all of this, and specifically the science of the powered flight on the surface of Mars. There is actually something really intriguing that's even visible in this short video. Turns out that on Mars, the dust dynamics are extremely different from what we experience on Earth. And turns out that when the helicopter takes off here, it manages to kick up approximately 4 pounds of dust, kind of visible in this video right here. And that's way more than what would happen on Earth. It basically means that after the 50th flight, by now it displaced approximately 100 kilograms of Martian dust. And that's of course something we have to be aware of for similar missions in the future, including a potential Mars aircraft that the scientists are currently developing in the Langley Research Center. And so in this case, because of lower gravity and the lack of atmosphere, this is something that we have to be aware of for future missions involving aircraft, or even future missions for objects like Titan. The Titan Dragonfly mission is expected to be a much more advanced helicopter, and because Titan has even less gravity, this might become a problem after a few years. But at least for now, that's all we have from Ingenuity and Perseverance. Definitely great missions, but so much more to come. If you're curious, you can read the scientific report on the effects of dust in the description below. But here we had so many other discoveries from Mars coming from other studies as well. And even some really exciting new maps that you can explore by yourself by using one of the links in the description. And I actually wanted to start with this. This is one of the links in the description, and this literally represents the most detailed and the most accurate 3D mosaic ever produced of the red planet. Here you can basically browse pretty much all of the locations on Mars, with all this being a result of approximately 110,000 different images collected by NASA's Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter, with the average resolution of approximately 25 square meters per pixel. So here is, for example, where Perseverance is right now, with the overall path that it's taking. And so this is sort of like Google Earth, but on Mars. Something that we've never had, and surprisingly, something that's a result of just one person, Bruce Murray, of the Laboratory for Planetary Visualization. And so he was able to create this by basically stitching together a lot of different images collected over the years. Now, I'm not going to go through this just now, this probably deserves its own video sometimes in the future, but from now on I'll probably be using this the most when I need to explain something very specific about Martian surface. And speaking of Martian surface, and speaking of visualizations, oh, by the way, you can kind of see that some parts here are still not really covered very well. Anyway, we also have this. Now, what is this, you may ask? Well, just like so many previous discoveries on Mars, these are some unusual geological features that seem to only exist on the red planet. Very strange, very bizarre, round dunes. Slightly asymmetrical in some locations, which probably means that the sand on those parts moved just a little bit more. But in this case, nobody really knows why some of them are so perfectly circular. Here's an image showing this in slightly more light. kind of showing us the structure as well. And here their approximate location compared to a lot of other dunes. Now this is obviously not the first time someone found something really unusual and unexplainable on the surface of Mars. As a matter of fact, here are some other dunes that basically resemble an upside-down Star Trek logo, but stuff like this always seems to exist on the planet, and as one of the recent studies concluded, which actually used artificial intelligence to try to examine the formation of some of these dunes compared to the ones on Earth, in most cases, these seem to be a result of fluid-like airflow in low atmospheric pressures on the surface of Mars. Something very similar happens on Earth, and these are very often known as the Barchan dunes, but the pressure on Earth is much higher, so the dunes form different shapes. Still, cool stuff, really exciting, and I'm sure so many more will be discovered in the future. But we also had quite a lot of new discoveries coming from various rovers, including the Curiosity rover, currently exploring the Gale crater, located somewhere right here. Now in this case, it actually found quite a lot of different geological signs of what seems to be ancient water. And one of the more recent discoveries is the confirmation for the existence of opal. And on Earth, and most likely on Mars, these require liquid water to form, which is why it's referred to as the hydrated amorphous form of silica. But this wasn't even the first and the only discovery. It also discovered unusual formations that seem to resemble rippled rock. But this rock was also showing signs of cyclical nature of water, with these ripples indicating ancient sediment that was probably stirred by waves, with water moving around and receding once in a while. And so all of these signs of waves, and of course the rhythmic layers, suggests very active Martian climate with a lot of complexity. And though this obviously existed on Earth for many years as well, here we have plate tectonics that erased all of the signs of this happening in the distant past. But on Mars, due to the lack of plate tectonics, this remains visible to us and can now be actively studied by all of these rovers. And the indication here is that the water was probably at least 300 meters deep, but also very likely contained quite a lot of carbonaceous material, very similar to early Earth. With one implication being, could there have been actual life before Earth? Not a question we can answer yet. Although intriguingly, a separate study has also discovered what seems to be signs of really ancient glaciers. And this was discovered by looking at salt deposits from ancient seawater. These are known as LTDs, or light-toned deposits, and they seem to exist in many different places on Mars. And because there's no surface ice located in those locations now, it means that the ice existed a long time ago, and might have disappeared through sublimation, or even by melting, millions and billions of years ago. Although the scientists think that it might still exist under the surface, and so by digging deep into this, we might be able to find some ancient water as well. But what's intriguing about Mars is not even the fact that it had water, but that it seems to have very active, chemically enriched atmosphere that we generally associate with water cycle on Earth today. And at first the scientists were not sure what's happening here until they realized that, once again, Mars is just really weird. The actual processes on Mars are very different from Earth, and many of these do not require water right now. And specifically here, the scientists were kind of confused about the presence of a lot of different chemical compounds, such as chlorates, perchlorates, and carbonates, and specifically the presence of atmospheric chlorine. And on Mars, chlorine is one of these so-called 5 mobile elements, along with hydrogen, oxygen, carbon, and sulfur. And it looks like the scientists might have figured out how it's able to move around and have this unusual cycle. It seems to be connected to lightning, although not really the same kind of lightning as on Earth. On our planet, lightning produces very beautiful visual effects and produces these beautiful arcs that you see, which would be impossible on Mars because all of this is actually atmospheric in nature. Instead, various electrical effects on Martian surface would be very similar to typical aurora on Earth, resembling very unusual electrical glow. And once every 3 Martian years, Mars tends to have really large storms. Storms that are so strong that they actually dramatically increase friction between dust particles, making them extremely electrified. On Earth, this would result in a thunderstorm. But on the red planet, it does something a little bit different. It creates something the scientists refer to as frictional electrification, where electrical charge builds up and starts to create very powerful discharges, which then starts to release chlorine and very likely produces a lot of other chemical reactions as well. And the calculations in this case suggest that this very likely happens at a rate that's about 100 times more than on Earth, with these types of chemical reactions being extremely common on the surface here, which very likely doesn't just produce all of this chlorine and various chlorine elements, but just generally produces a lot of complex electrochemical reactions that we barely understand at all. Not to mention that these types of reactions, in theory, could also produce a lot of elements required for life, so maybe somewhere out there, on some distant object very similar to Mars, this could possibly even start life in some other way. Or at least produce all of the necessary elements for future life to start when the liquid water appears on the surface. So in other words, the discovery here is of an unusual lightning cycle, or the cycle of electric discharge, which usually becomes very dramatic and very powerful every 3 Martian years, or approximately every 6 Earth years. But that's not something we're going to be able to study until we physically go here. And, well, that takes us to the next discovery/study, a potential crewed mission that was recently proposed based on a lot of analysis and a lot of studies from the current mission design. Turns out, because of all of the complexity of the current design, it's quite likely that we're not going to have a crewed mission until possibly 2037. The actual mission profile is just a little bit too complex, and there are too many points of failure, and so realistically, if we were to test everything, nothing would be ready until 2037. However, a different team of researchers recently published this paper you can find in the description, reworking some of the complexity and making something else possible by 2033. Essentially, a mission to Mars that uses a flyby near Venus in order to come back to Earth. These are known as the gravitational assists, and usually allow the spacecraft to change trajectory or to save fuel by using a planetary object. But what exactly makes this unusual mission interesting? Well, first of all, that it's doable using current technology. In this case, the scientists worked out that you don't need to invent anything new, and we already have everything required for the mission to start. So nothing has to be tested. On top of this, in 2033, there's going to be an extremely rare alignment between Mars, Earth, and Venus, which permits this unusual gravitational assist in order to return to Earth much quicker, and thus prevent astronauts from experiencing too much time in space, which can potentially be somewhat hazardous. The total mission length would be about 570 days or 1.6 years, which is dramatically shorter than any other proposition, with even the spacecraft design being much simpler. But the main difference here is that there would not be any landing, simply because, well, first of all, it is a little bit trickier and requires a lot more testing, and second of all, because we don't really have the spacecraft for that just yet. And so instead this would be an orbital mission lasting for approximately 1 month around Mars. But I guess more importantly, it would also include a flyby, an actual crewed flyby, around Venus. And this is super exciting because it would be also the first time humans ever visited this beautiful planet. Although we're probably going to see something like this because most of it is covered by the very thick atmosphere. And so there's a slight chance that, maybe just maybe, we might be able to visit Mars for the first time sometime in 2033 after all. But we don't really know exactly what happens yet, because at the moment all of the focus is on the Artemis mission and the return to the Moon. Assuming that mission is successful, I'm pretty sure we're going to start talking about Mars a little bit more often. And I just realized I'm going to be 50 by then. Holy cow. And by then I'm probably going to have to come up with some new design for the t-shirt, which as always you can find in the description. Hello wonderful person, this is Anton, and today we're going to be talking about Mars. Well, not just the whole planet. We're going to be talking about that one specific mission that we haven't discussed in a very long time. The Chinese Tianwen-1 mission, and specifically the Zhurong rover that you see right here. But the main question being, what exactly happened to it? Why is it that we haven't heard about it in a very long time? And why has China not really posted anything about it in the last few months? Especially because some of the recent photos from the Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter that you see right here, the spacecraft operated around Mars by NASA, has actually released some of the new pictures showing us exactly where this rover is located. You can sort of see it as a tiny green blob very close to that crater. And these pictures taken between 2022 and 2023 show us that the rover hasn't really moved at all in the last few months. Which I guess raises the question, did it break down? Did something happen to it? And so in this video I wanted to discuss some of the things that we've learned from this rover in the last year and a half, but more importantly talk a little bit more about the science behind this, but also discuss some of the cool design features of this rover that were supposed to prevent whatever happened here, or here, wherever the rover is. But let's start with a very brief review of what this mission was. Especially if you don't want to watch that video that reviews all of this, that should be in the description below. The video that talks more about this mission itself. So anyway, this was part of the Tianwen-1 mission, the first Chinese mission to Mars. And technically the Chinese third rover ever, following the successful rovers on the Moon, specifically the U2 rovers you see right here. which, as I mentioned in some of the previous videos, kind of allows us to relive and re-experience some of the excitements from the 70s and the 80s when the American and the Soviet space programs were pretty much doing the same, landing on the moon and then trying to land on Mars. But for China, they obviously learned from all of the failures of the other programs and were able to successfully land the Martian rover on the first try, using a descent module reminiscent of some of the earlier NASA missions, with a relatively similar profile to the NASA's Mars Pathfinder, the rover that landed back in 1997. And the success in this case made China the third ever country to successfully soft land on the surface of Mars, but only the second country after the US to successfully operate something for a pretty long time. I've actually discussed the curse of Mars for the Soviet program that has never succeeded to operate anything here despite multiple launches in the past. And interestingly, one of the first things that the rover did once it descended from the landing platform was actually take this really cool selfie. And it did so by placing a remote camera on the ground that then was able to communicate via Wi-Fi and send the pictures back to the rover, then relaying it to the orbiter above Mars. So somewhere out there on the surface of Mars, there's literally a Chinese remotely operated Wi-Fi camera that's by now probably all covered in dust, but was able to take a really cool selfie. And its original mission was only supposed to last for 3 months. So following its descent on May 15th of 2021, by mid-June it was supposed to finish its mission. But just like with NASA rovers, it was able to continuously extend its program, and the engineers from China were able to extend the mission much longer. As a matter of fact, over the past 2 years, it was able to travel approximately 2 kilometers across the Martian surface, surviving way longer and producing way more data than anyone ever expected. And because it did possess quite a lot of different instruments, including a ground-penetrating radar able to see approximately 100 meters into the depth of Mars, in the process, the rover also made some really cool discoveries about the red planet. For example, one of the biggest discoveries in the last couple of years was definitive evidence for really large floods that happened on the planet several billion years ago. And specifically, it discovered both hydrated minerals, very likely created by ancient water on Mars, but was also able to use its radar to see deep into the ground, discovering 2 horizontal layers at a depth of about 20 meters and about 30 to 80 meters, with the larger rocks 30 to 80 meters deep showing previous interaction with ancient water, suggesting some kind of an ancient flood, and then detecting something very similar but at a much smaller scale, approximately 10 to 30 meters deep, implying that this happened again a few billion years later. With the main implication being that a long time ago, probably about 3 billion years ago, there was a huge flood on Mars, specifically in the region known as the Utopia Planitia. The region that's mostly to the north of Mars and is generally much lower and also much younger than a lot of other surface on the planet. It's also very close to where the current Perseverance rover is, but not exactly in the same location. But because of that detection at 20 meters deep, it suggested that the flood happened again about 1.5 billion years ago, but was also probably mixed with a lot of glacial activity happening at the same time, which means that Mars definitely went through several periods where the liquid water could have existed on the surface, but it might have existed for different reasons. For example, some of it was probably created as a result of some kind of a volcanic activity, and some of it might have been a result of a huge asteroid collision sometime in the past. And we've actually discussed some of the tsunamis that were detected that were produced by some of these asteroids in some of the videos you can find in the description below. Either way, the fact that this rover was able to discover all of the signs of liquid water that existed in this area at least twice was actually a pretty big discovery. And a discovery that nobody expected the rover to make because its mission was only supposed to last for 3 months. And so a lot of international scientists, especially ESA scientists, were super intrigued to collaborate more with China and wanted this mission to continue so that they can actually learn more about Mars, especially because the European mission that was supposed to land here a couple of years ago failed crashing on the surface. But Mars is not Earth, and the conditions here are very different from what anyone can plan for or what anyone can currently anticipate. And so even though China has extensively tested its rover and designed it specifically to withstand Martian nights and, of course, Martian dust storms, as this image here shows us, something happened to the rover and it might have actually finished its mission for one reason or another. But here it's worth mentioning the research that China put into this, even designing a specifically shaped type of solar panels in order to avoid Martian storms from affecting them as much. Here are actually some of the earlier designs trying to figure out what shape would be the best in order for the Martian dust not to get stuck on the panels and in order for it to be shaken off much easier. They eventually settled for the design that's a little bit more angled and covered with anti-dust coating that was supposed to prevent the dust from accumulating and the solar panels from failing, which was of course the main reason for the failure of the Mars InSight mission just a few months ago and the Mars Opportunity rover back in 2018. In other words, solar panels on Mars have a very short lifespan because dust seems to stick to them really well. And even though China thought that maybe some kind of an anti-dust coating might help, in reality a lot of this is probably due to static electricity. Because Martian air is so dry, a lot of dust motion across the surface tends to create huge amounts of static. Previous studies have even suggested that it might be impossible to, for example, fly helicopters on Mars, because the blades will suddenly experience huge shocks from all of this accumulated static. Now the static still affects the blades, but turns out the blades survive just fine. But when it comes to the solar panels, it tends to stick to them almost permanently, and it becomes extremely difficult to remove it because of the static. As a matter of fact, for the InSight mission, the engineers were able to successfully remove some of this dust only twice. First time by literally trying to put more dust on the panels, spraying just a little bit on the surface, and second time when completely by accident a dust devil dislodged some of the dust from the surface by creating a miniature tornado right above the panels. But for this to happen you have to get super lucky. And even though it did happen, the InSight rover eventually just lost all of its power and the mission had to be shut down a few months ago. And right now that's what everyone believes happened to the Zhurong rover as well. Because the recent dust storm was pretty heavy and once again affected quite a lot of equipment on Mars, despite the earlier Chinese preparations, where they essentially shut down all of the non-essential instruments, only leaving the essential instruments functioning, it appears that the rover might have shut down after all, because it hasn't moved in the last few months, and so far China has not really reported anything. And that's because it was supposed to come out of its hibernation and start reporting new data last month. Although it could still maybe wake up in the next few months, as the temperature on Mars goes up and provides just enough temperature to charge some of its batteries, which might have died because of the cold. And so if it does come back to life, it would be a huge achievement for the Chinese Space Agency, but more importantly, potentially present us with a really good opportunity for how future missions like this could be launched in order to avoid Martian dust storms. Because there's actually something else that China did to this rover to make it potentially survive a little bit longer. And it's something that's kind of intriguing and kind of, I guess, a little bit strange. Somewhere underneath the solar panels and much closer to the center of the rover, the agency attached 10 containers with something known as an undecane, which is a type of a chemical that you can technically find on Earth, and is also what's known as an alkane hydrocarbon, but is also apparently a mild sex attractant for various cockroaches and moths. So yeah, if there are any cockroaches on Mars, they're probably really excited to see that rover. But one of the reasons they actually use this particular compound on the rover is because when it solidifies or when it freezes into ice, it starts to release a relatively large amount of heat. And it does so around the same temperature as the night temperature on Mars, which essentially means that during nighttime or during the colder periods, this particular compound is used to keep batteries and a lot of other important elements much warmer than they would be otherwise, allowing them to survive the Martian night. And then during Martian daytime, it melts, collecting the heat from the sun, which basically means that this cycle can be repeated every single Martian day. And so this is a pretty interesting way of keeping this particular rover warm even at night. And of course also means that through these chemical reactions inside the undecane containers, at some point the batteries might warm up just enough to allow the rover to come back to life. And so a lot of researchers, even Western researchers, are secretly really hoping that it is going to come back to life because of all of the incredible discoveries it made so far. And if it does come to life, it means that their strategy of using an undecane, or let's just call it what it is, the cockroach sex hormone, mixed with the technique that used the angled solar panels covered in very specific anti-dust compound, might actually be a viable strategy for all of the future missions involving solar panels on Mars. But because we haven't heard anything just yet, at the moment nobody really knows what really happened. As a matter of fact, even Chinese researchers are a little bit confused and a little bit surprised by the fact that there's no official announcement just yet. So chances are that the Chinese engineers are still trying to figure out if the rover is functioning or if it failed completely, but we're probably not going to know details just yet. If it does come back to life though, there are already several different locations the scientists are hoping to visit, including a nearby intriguing crater, but also an intriguing location that might have been some kind of a mud volcano billions of years ago. Hello wonderful person, this is Anton, and today we're going to be talking about some new discoveries coming from our neighbor Mars. Some from within Mars itself, and some from the surface of Mars billions of years ago. With at least some of these discoveries actually being very surprising, redefining our understanding of what Mars is as a planet, or redefining our understanding of internal activity of Mars itself. And let's actually start with this particular story, because it's probably the biggest discovery of them all. It looks like Mars might be geologically alive after all, not a dead planet that scientists envisioned it for decades and decades. It seems to contain quite a lot of signs that there is a lot of internal activity, with some of this activity even leading to volcanoes in relatively recent geological times, which is something that the scientists really didn't expect. Because Mars is much smaller than planet Earth and planet Venus, it's always been believed that over time it just became kind of solidified with its internal structure, instead of producing some kind of a dynamo, eventually becoming solid and still. In other words, that the internal activity of Mars very likely ceased to exist billions of years ago. Whereas on both Earth and Venus, because the size and mass is much bigger, both planets are still relatively hot inside, and both contain active mantle that pushes things around, moves things around as well, and eventually produces activity on the surface, which, at least on Earth, results in both plate tectonics and of course volcanism from a lot of massive plumes. Mantle plumes that move around, pushing surface up, and sometimes escaping to the surface through volcanic eruptions. And I think here, a lava lamp analogy might make the most sense. On both Earth and Venus, we have a lot of this going on inside the planets. Whereas on Mars, it was believed that this stopped a long time ago. But when it did exist, it was very active. So active, as a matter of fact, that it produced the biggest volcano in the solar system, Olympus Mons, along with several other really large volcanoes visible from really far away. For example, the biggest region is known as the Tharsis region, that, as you can see, has quite a lot of volcanoes, all pretty much in the same location. This was very likely produced by some kind of a humongous plume. But there's also a smaller region known as the Elysium region that obviously has a few volcanoes as well. But all of these were created over 3 billion years ago, and so it was always believed that this was basically the end of Martian geological activity. However, something unexpected started happening when NASA landed the InSight probe. The probe that's about to end its mission because its solar panels are no longer operational. But in the last few years, surprisingly, it was actually detecting a huge amount of earthquakes, some being relatively strong as well, and this is not something scientists expected at all. And a lot of these earthquakes were actually originating from a relatively similar area. And interestingly, when the scientists were originally planning this mission, they actually specifically chose a location that they thought is going to be relatively quiet. There are not going to be a lot of disturbances, there are not going to be a lot of smaller earthquakes, mostly because it was believed to be flat and quiet. You can sort of see the location right here on this map. And the reason they wanted this location to be quiet is of course because they were going to be using very sensitive instruments to listen to a lot of vibrations coming through the planet, essentially studying its geology through minute earthquakes detected by very sensitive instruments. And originally this already gave the scientists a bit of a hint that something else was going on here, in this case something inside the planet itself. But in the last few years, the scientists started to discover some really unusual hints in this region known as Elysium Planitia, with first hints being volcanism at least 200 million years ago, but more importantly, small explosions of volcanic ash that might have happened 53,000 years ago, with the actual ash deposits being really young and up until now being somewhat controversial. But a lot of these signs were definitively confirmed by various scientists in the region known as Cerberus fossa, an unusual set of young fissures or young cracks that actually stretch for more than 800 miles or nearly 1200 kilometers across the entire surface of Mars. So maybe not the same type of volcanism as on planet Earth, but definitely something really unusual and definitely something implying that Mars might still be active. But all of these were hints detected before, years ago. Something else, a lot more definitive, was identified very recently, something that suggests that Mars is indeed active, and these fissures are just one of the signs. With a lot of this analysis focusing on the surface itself and the inclination or the location of various features, compared to some of the other features such as craters. For example, many of these fractures cut through various hills and various craters that are relatively young as well. Here we're talking about something that was created in the last billion years, which obviously suggests that these happened way after. On top of this, and this is really important, an entire region was uplifted by at least 1 kilometer or sometimes even 2 kilometers, making this one of the highest regions in the northern lowlands. It's obviously not the only region uplifted in such a way, but in this case, there is something else that makes it a little bit unusual. The surface of the entire area is actually tilted just a little bit away from a certain imaginary center, as if something from beneath the surface pushed onto the crust and lifted this entire area. And that's kind of what usually plumes do. A massive plume, such as the one in, for example, Hawaii, will usually uplift the surface, but will also then start producing volcanism, which basically is how Hawaii was created as well. Another really common example is, of course, Iceland. And if they're correct in their assumption, this implies that this is a giant plume. It's very likely 3,000 to 4,000 kilometers wide, and is probably the reason why we have all these unusual features that could not be explained otherwise. It explains the Cerberus fossa that go for over 1,000 kilometers. It also explains recent observations of volcanism as far back as 53,000 years ago. But more importantly, it also explains why InSight has been detecting so many unusual earthquakes, and some actually relatively powerful ones, coming from this region that was expected to be really quiet with nothing going on. And from what we know about planet Earth, we usually expect two types of geological activities to be able to create so many excessive earthquakes, either plate tectonics or really large plumes underneath the crust itself. And since the surface observations determined there is definitely no plate tectonics anywhere, massive powerful plumes is the only other potential explanation. But because this is still going on and because this is definitely not finished yet, it also implies that volcanoes can one day become active again and potentially even produce enough emissions or even enough heat on the planet to maybe even melt some of the ice caps, or maybe even create liquid water, at least for a little bit. But more importantly, in this case, in our search for extraterrestrial life, these types of volcanic regions are usually known to host a lot of exotic life. As a matter of fact, all of these emissions and all of the energy produced is basically heaven for a lot of different bacteria. And so officially this is now the best region for us to potentially find some kind of extraterrestrial life somewhere on Mars, which makes this a really exciting region to land in for any future mission. But that's one of the first discoveries. The other discovery is, I guess, from a little bit way back, when Mars looked very different and possessed a huge ocean and possibly habitable conditions on the surface. And in this case, the scientists have identified a cometary impact from approximately 3.4 billion years ago, responsible for one of the biggest tsunamis on Mars, or possibly even some of the biggest in the solar system, but also somewhat equivalent to the one that was responsible for the demise of dinosaurs here on Earth 65 million years ago. But it's obviously not the first time we talk about these tsunamis on Mars, and actually one of the older videos from a few years ago discusses some of the first discoveries by NASA and by a lot of different studies. Here the scientists were able to identify at least 2 cases of major tsunami events, very likely happening just a few million years apart, but both having slightly different effects. The younger tsunami might have occurred when the oceans were already much smaller, and the analysis was actually able to definitively show that there was quite a lot of deposit from what seemed to be a tsunami, and in this case a tsunami that was really large. And though the evidence for the tsunami was clear, it wasn't clear what created it. The crater was not found just yet. There were some speculations about craters that could have created this, but it wasn't certain. But the new analysis goes in a little bit more detail, even recreating the potential tsunami wave, while even discovering certain fallout effects, as well as other deposits, confirming that this is exactly what probably happened. And intriguingly enough, the Viking 1 lander basically landed on top of some of these older deposits. Now prior to this crater didn't really have a name, but they now named it Pole, and it has a diameter of approximately 110 kilometers and is located in the northern lowlands as well. The region that was very likely covered by the oceans, with a potential depth of about 120 meters. And the asteroid that collided with Mars was either 3 kilometers in size, as the smallest estimate, up to possibly 9 kilometers in size, as the largest estimate. It really depends on how deep the oceans were, and also on the amount of ground resistance when the asteroid hit Mars. But it resulted in a megatsunami, very likely 200 to 300 meters tall, moving approximately 1500 kilometers away from the center of the explosion and creating all of these distant deposits visible today, which is actually surprisingly similar to what happened on Earth 65 million years ago. The dinosaur killer asteroid very likely produced extremely similar effects. And so what makes the study intriguing is of course the discovery of the official crater, responsible for at least one of these megatsunamis, and the naming of the crater as well as the simulation and the explanation for everything observed. But we also had some other discoveries in regards to water on Mars, with many of these discoveries suggesting that Mars back then was extremely Earth-like. More Earth-like than we even think. with, for example, one recent study identifying several new lakes and lake deposits that existed here for millions of years. Although in some cases some of these lakes actually were a chain of lakes, basically all connected to one another, so possibly a little bit different from what we have on Earth, but still producing very similar effects. And so all of these potentially habitable conditions, along with recent discoveries of still active volcanism, still really make Mars the most likely place to potentially find extraterrestrial life. And if we don't find it here, or on other objects such as Titan and Enceladus in Europa, that's of course when we have to start asking questions. Can life actually exist anywhere else? Hello wonderful person, this is Anton, and today we're going to be discussing some of the recent updates from planet Mars, specifically from the NASA's Ingenuity, Perseverance, and to some extent NASA's InSight probe as well, focusing on some of the recent achievements, some of the recent discoveries, and of course some of the more important updates. And here, I guess, let's start with this probe behind me, because it's going to be a pretty short story, and maybe a pretty sad one. NASA's InSight has officially ended its mission, with this right here being the last image that the mission is going to be able to take. Because of the amount of dust that accumulated on the solar panels, the InSight probe is unfortunately unable to collect any more energy, and is ending its mission somewhat prematurely. Although in this case, it did make some groundbreaking discoveries about Mars during its few years when it was still operational. And specifically one of its most recent major discoveries was the biggest Marsquake we've ever heard. This Marsquake was thousands of times more powerful than any other one detected previously, although compared to planet Earth it was still somewhat insignificant. The magnitude here was about 4.7, which means that compared to Earth it was somewhat weak. But for Mars, this is a significant discovery, because it once again confirms that there is something weird about Martian geology, and as you might have learned from one of the previous videos in the description, the recent discoveries do suggest that Mars is still quite active. As a matter of fact, it might actually resume its volcanic activity in the near future, something that nobody expected up until now. And so the InSight probe was responsible for making a lot of geological discoveries about Mars in the last few years, essentially changing our understanding of this unusual planet. You can learn more about this in one of the previous videos in the description. But nevertheless, this is most likely the end of the mission. It just cannot function anymore and has to be retired. But the other missions, Perseverance and Ingenuity, have been doing really well. As a matter of fact, despite all of the unusual problems both missions have experienced, they have been really persevering, as the name suggests. For example, the Perseverance probe has already collected 23 different samples from various regions, which is already more than half of all of the samples it's going to be collecting. And it's been slowly dropping these samples in various places near the region where it landed to essentially be picked up by the next step of the mission in the next 10 years or so. Now here the main reason for these samples is to actually collect as much evidence as possible for what might have happened on Mars billions of years ago, and potentially collect signs of maybe habitable conditions. Which is why so far the scientists have tried to focus on collecting a variety of different samples from a variety of different areas. But intriguingly enough, some of the preliminary analysis conducted by the instruments known as Sherlock and Pixel, that are able to conduct the analysis in the UV and the X-ray light, started to reveal something really unusual about the location where this particular mission has landed. Now you might remember that the original reason for this landing, the Zhurong crater, was because it was always believed to be some kind of an ancient lake bed with potential rivers flowing into the lake itself. All of this was of course based on the topography and the overall shape of the area that kind of resembled what we see here on planet Earth. And so basically the visual evidence was definitely there. But the discoveries from this paper that you can find in the description, essentially based on the analysis of these samples, along with two other papers that are going to be published around the same time, kind of revealed almost the opposite. The preliminary analysis of various rocks in this area suggests that there's really very little evidence for the existence of ancient water. Or, if there was water, it was some kind of an ice mix, potentially with a lot of salty brine inside, and essentially was more of a slush than water itself. Which is of course a really intriguing first implication or first discovery, but I was really wondering why the scientists thought so. Well, the geological analysis here was pretty clear. First of all, the visual analysis clearly indicated that most of the weathering around the rocks happened because of the Martian wind and not because of the ancient water, with some effects from the radiation as well, and from things like various chemical reactions present in the Martian atmosphere. On top of this, and this is the more important part, they've discovered minerals rich in what's known as olivine. Now, on Earth, this is a mineral that we usually find really deep inside the planet, but it tends to get dissolved pretty quickly when there is liquid water present on the surface of the planet. Yet on Mars, there is definitely a lot more olivine present in the minerals compared to anything we have here on planet Earth, with a lot of the signs indicating that it wasn't really affected by a lot of water that might have been here. There were some effects, but not a lot. And this means that if there was any exposure, it might have been really brief. Or maybe the water was very different from your typical liquid water. It was basically what we usually refer to as brine, extremely salty water that does kind of act like slush when it's really cold. Very highly saturated in salts, which is why it couldn't dissolve the olivine. They've also discovered some other elements here, such as sulfates and perchlorates, which could have been left behind by brines that used to exist here. With all this currently indicating that if there was any water here, it was probably not how we originally imagined it. If this was an actual lake, typical lake like on planet Earth, all of this would have been dissolved a long time ago. But if there was a lake that was frozen for most of its existence, containing a lot of briny water, could potentially explain these initial observations. Although these are still very initial observations in initial analysis, so we don't really know what we're going to find out in the next few years. As a matter of fact, it could just be the location where Perseverance has so far collected the samples, maybe just following a path that's not particularly rich in ancient water. And on top of this, even though there were some initial signs of potential discovery of interesting organic molecules, including molecules similar to benzene, the presence of olivine in these regions suggests that there was probably no life present here either, because olivine would probably not really be in the same shape as we found it. In other words, olivine, because of chemical reactions or because of various bacteria, generally changes pretty quickly. In this case though, it didn't change. And so the presence of olivine in these regions at the moment sort of suggests that these regions were not really watery and not really filled with life either. But the mission also had some other really intriguing discoveries. In this case, an actual sound of what seems to be an extraterrestrial whirlwind, or essentially a miniature Martian tornado. And here it ended up passing right above the probe itself, in the process allowing the scientists to measure everything from the pressure to the sound itself. Basically, the microphone picked up the sounds. And well, here's what it sort of sounded like. Now, the good thing about this particular whirlwind, and the good thing for the future Martian missions, is the fact that the pressure and the sound itself was extremely weak. The pressure here was only about 1% of what you would experience on Earth. So that means that, all those scenes from the Martian where, the tornado or the storm sort of causes the rocket to fall down, that's very unlikely to happen. The force of these whirlwinds on Mars is extremely weak. But you will definitely hear the sound. But only for like a second or so. This was moving at 25 miles per hour and was actually gone really fast, with the pressure drop only detectable by an extremely sensitive instrument. A human being would not feel it. So that's Perseverance. But then we also had some major updates from the Ingenuity helicopter that basically still keeps going. As a matter of fact, as a joke, several scientists have already suggested that maybe this should be called Perseverance because it just won't stop flying. This helicopter first flew on April 19th of 2021 and has now officially conducted 38 flights. And even though in March of 2022, NASA officially announced that it might extend the mission to September of 2022, as of December of 2022, it still keeps going. It's been flying for over 600 days, and it's been essentially setting new flight records on a different planet. And remember, the original mission was only supposed to last for 30 days, maybe maximum 5 flights. But it just won't stop. As a matter of fact, this mission has been so successful that NASA has now decided to propose what's known as Mars Sample Recovery Helicopter that's essentially going to serve as the main way to collect the samples dropped by the Perseverance probe, with at least 2 tiny helicopters essentially collecting the samples and then returning them to the rocket that's going to come back to planet Earth. Although all of this will probably not occur for at least 10 more years. In other words, we don't expect the samples to return until 2033. Nevertheless, back in April of 2022, during the 25th flight, it was able to set new records for the highest speed and the highest distance traveled, flying for 708 meters at the maximum speed of 5.5 meters per second. But then, as you might remember from some of the previous videos, it also started to experience a bit of a problem with the drop in total pressure because of the seasonal change on Mars. During Martian summer, the decrease in air density required the helicopter to start spinning its blades much faster. But also around the same time, on May 3rd of 2022, the communication with the helicopter unexpectedly failed. This was right after the 28th flight. And the engineers behind this mission now believe that it was very likely because of these changes in pressure, but also because of the changes in the atmospheric dust that probably reduced the amount of energy the solar panels were generating, and when the battery reached a certain limit, the onboard computer reset the mission clock, which unfortunately lost the synchronization with the Perseverance rover. And this in effect caused the problems with the rover communication, but it was resolved pretty quickly. By turning off internal heaters and allowing some of the energy to be preserved inside, the communication was restored and the helicopter could fly again. Although in this case there was always a fear that every single day could be the Ingenuity's last. The deficits in power persisted up until October, and so it was actually uncertain if the mission could maybe fail. But something else happened in June. Another part of the helicopter failed for unknown reasons. A part known as inclinometer. This is the part that's responsible for the orientation measurements at the start of each flight. But since we're talking about NASA engineers here, they basically found a workaround using a different unit known as IMU, Inertial Measurement Unit, that was able to do pretty much the same. And so here, Flight 29 was actually the most nerve-wracking. It was the first flight without inclinometer and also in cold weather. But it definitely worked. And then, for approximately 2 months, the helicopter did nothing. It was basically just waiting for the weather to get better. With Flight 30 meant to test if the helicopter can still fly accurately after 2 months of inactivity. And it definitely did. Then, during Flight 33, there was an unusual fabric stuck to the helicopter that at first was believed to be part of the helicopter itself. But eventually the team realized that it was actually something from the parachute responsible for landing the entire mission, and this actually fell off pretty quickly. Then, Flight 34, even though it didn't look exciting, was exciting for a different reason. It involved a major update to the entire software, allowing the helicopter to now avoid various hazards, and also, most importantly, use actual digital elevation maps to help it navigate by itself, without the use of any manual commands. Or basically it gave the helicopter a lot more autonomy and allowed it to take off, land and fly much more safely. But also it provided a lot of new places where the helicopter could now land, even in more dangerous rocky areas. Then during Flight 35, it was able to reach a new height of 14 meters or 46 feet. This is the record so far. And for the next 2 flights, including the Flight 38, it essentially acted as a scout for the Perseverance rover. In essence, flying ahead of the rover, exploring the areas for potential sampling, but also relaying a lot of the mapping data as the helicopter explores and observes various areas. But I guess more importantly, it's been able to do so way beyond what was expected. For 38 flights, it's functioned for over a year and a half, and it seems to be still doing okay. And that's really the incredible part. Nobody has ever expected this thing to even fly, but it seems to be not just flying, but doing so much more than we ever hoped for. Which means that even next year I'm probably still going to be talking about this mission and the helicopter itself, potentially exploring some other new findings and new discoveries or new achievements from the entire Mars 2020 mission. But until future discoveries, well, that's pretty much it. So there are quite a lot of different mysteries about various objects in the solar system, and many of these mysteries will often involve some sort of a moon of some kind of a planet, for example Saturn, Jupiter, or Mars. But looks like one of these mysteries, in regards to one of the moons, might have been solved, at least to some extent. Hello wonderful person, this is Anton, and today we're going to be talking about this unusual feature that you see right here on Phobos, the moon of Mars. These unusual stripe-like features, or almost like scratches, whose origin was always mysterious ever since they were originally found decades ago, with at least 2 ideas trying to explain what's actually happening here and how these stripes were potentially formed. But looks like we might finally have an answer, and actually quite a definitive answer at that, based on some of the recent simulations from NASA that essentially allow us to not just understand how these features were formed, but what exactly is going to happen to Phobos in the next 50 million years. and to some extent also connecting these particular features to some of the other ones we've discovered in the solar system that we're going to be discussing near the end of the video. But first, what exactly is Phobos? Well, we don't really know its exact origin, but it's essentially what we usually refer to as a dwarf moon. And they're called that for an obvious reason. They're really tiny compared to a lot of other moons, and obviously compared to Mars itself. Phobos is only about 11.3 kilometers across. The second moon, Deimos, is approximately half the size. But because these moons orbit in a very similar fashion to how Mars rotates, it was always implied that their formation history might actually be related to some kind of a major collision with Mars a long time ago that ended up producing these two objects through essentially emissions from the surface of Mars. But it was also proposed that maybe these were just captured asteroids from the asteroid belt, although this particular explanation did not really satisfy a lot of scientists simply because of the orbits observed. So their origin story is still a bit of a mystery. But what's not a mystery is that Phobos seems to be moving closer to Mars, approximately 2 centimeters per year. And that means that within about 30 to maybe 50 million years, it will end up being shredded by the Martian gravity, by the tidal forces, and create a beautiful set of rings around Mars, making Mars the second ring planet. But it's also been speculated that after that, it might actually start separating from Mars again, recreating Phobos once again. And so some scientists have even speculated that this is a kind of a cycle that goes on around Mars every few 100 million years. But the point is that it's going to fall apart. It's going to be destroyed and create a set of rings. That part is almost certain. But what is not certain is the current topography or the current surface of the Phobos itself. Now, if you were to look around Phobos, there are usually two defining features of this unusual object. You can see both really well in this image by NASA. There is a huge crater known as the Stickney crater, created by some kind of a major collision millions of years ago, or possibly even billions of years ago. But there are also these unusual grooves, parallel grooves, that seem to stretch across the surface of the object, as if something scratched Phobos, or as if something rolled across it, or for some entirely different reason. Now, because they seem to emanate from the crater, the first original explanation that a lot of scientists kind of agreed with basically involved some kind of a major asteroid collision, possibly from the surface of Mars, that first of all created the crater, but then a lot of debris, mostly boulders, rolled across the surface, leaving behind these line-like formations. And because the gravity here was much lower, they were essentially able to roll across almost the entire surface. Although some explanations have even suggested that maybe some of these boulders or some of these scratches were actually caused by debris coming from Mars itself. But a lot of these earlier assumptions were made based on the fact that scientists thought that Phobos was actually kind of hard. It was basically relatively dense. But new observations reveal that it's really not. It's more of a rubble pile. It's a lot more powdery and actually has a huge amount of powder on the surface, potentially hundreds of meters thick. So in some sense it resembles a typical desert, at least in terms of the actual texture. And so because of that, scientists started to speculate that it was probably a different explanation, something that some other scientists proposed years ago as well, with all of this connected to that eventual fate of Phobos, the fate being falling apart and creating a set of rings. In other words, what the scientists actually suggest now is that it's a lot more likely that all of this is caused by tidal stress, implying that these are signs that Phobos is already falling apart. In other words, these are tidal stretch marks. The tidal forces from Mars are stretching and pulling Phobos so much that it started to acquire these unusual formations, and they make a pretty strong argument about it. And the reason why this is happening is of course because Phobos is already really close to Mars. A single orbit here only takes just over 7 hours. And that means that Phobos experiences very powerful tidal forces from Mars itself. And so in this case, here's what the scientists simulated and here's what they found. By trying to simulate a miniature Phobos, and by actually simulating the effects from Mars, they discovered that if you have a somewhat sand-like formation on the surface, or basically a kind of a loose layer, it will eventually start forming these grooves, as you can see in this simulation. And all this was repeated several times, with all of these formations forming every single time. And actually, formations here were almost exactly the same as observed in real life. Here's a kind of a surface view, or I guess top-down view, that shows you how all this forms in actually a relatively short time, with all of this providing evidence that Phobos is basically slowly falling apart, with the structure underneath already failing, creating these scratches we see. And more importantly, it also seems to be uncovering some of the hidden internal materials, which will eventually reveal the hidden interior structure of this moon. And so by actually collecting samples from these grooves, it might become possible to learn so much about the history of Phobos and the history of Mars. Although in this case the scientists do mention that their predictions were not perfectly aligned with observations, which could be because of different structure, which could imply that there might be more than one mechanism at work here, or that the structure and composition of Phobos is different depending on the location. In other words, there are still some questions to be answered. But in this case, the model is really convincing and definitely explains exactly what we're observing. More importantly, it also explains a lot of other objects that we know have very similar features and whose origin was also implied to be tidal in nature. For example, Neptune's moon Triton, which is also slowly moving closer and closer to the planet, is also experiencing tidal effects and also possesses several unexplained grooves that were very likely tidal in nature. But more importantly, the Saturn's Enceladus is actually filled with different grooves as well. But more specifically, it has these very unusual features known as tiger stripes, very close to the southern pole, with very thin ice where quite a lot of geyser-like emissions have been detected in the past, and that are actually going to be explored by some of the future missions in the next few years. And these unusual features, approximately 30 kilometers long, are also quite equally separated from one another and have been previously discovered to be created by a very specific orbital resonance with the partner Dione and by eccentric orbit around Saturn. And so this unusual orbit around Saturn and the interaction with the neighboring moon ended up creating a lot of tidal effects on the surface of Enceladus, which then results in very similar formation of the grooves, although in this case, instead of rocky-like silicate materials, it's basically mostly water, possibly mixed with some other materials and some other ices. Although intriguingly, another moon that has unusual stripes, Europa, the moon of Jupiter, seems to have these for possibly a very different reason. These have been implied to be very similar to what we have on Earth, plate tectonics. These could be actual plates, ice plates in this case, moving around, shifting around, interacting, and creating tectonic motion on the surface, mixing the internal and external materials. Although in this case, the motion and the interaction, just like in this system, is very likely caused by the larger planet. The gravity from Saturn and Jupiter is strong enough to drive all of these effects. And so in short, most of these stripes in the solar system seem to be usually caused by very strong gravity from a major body nearby and by essentially tidal interactions. The same types of forces that we usually attribute to, for example, black holes. The most extreme tidal interaction possible is usually around a supermassive black hole that destroys a star. These are known as the tidal disruption events. But obviously any object that has mass can produce tidal effects as well, just not as strong as a black hole. And you can find out more about these in some of the videos in the description. But at least for now, it looks like the scientists might have finally solved the mystery of Phobos, the moon of Mars. These stripes are most likely tidal in nature and are basically the first sign that the moon is falling apart and is eventually going to turn Mars into a ringed planet. But because Japan is planning a mission here in the next few years, and is actually going to be collecting samples from this particular moon, we might discover something else in the process, especially if they manage to collect samples from one of these grooves. So until these future discoveries, that's pretty much it. Hello wonderful person, this is Anton, and today we're going to be discussing some of the new updates coming from our beautiful neighbor Mars. And there's actually been quite a lot of different updates in the last few months that unfortunately I did not get to mention until now, although none of them are super groundbreaking, yet still kind of interesting. And I actually wanted to start with some of the new pictures that were released by NASA in the last few months, like this unusual picture of a rock balancing on another rock. Naturally, not something we see on Mars every day, and naturally something that is going to produce quite a lot of conspiracy theories, if it hasn't already, but this is something that's actually pretty common in various locations where there's quite a lot of different types of erosion, usually through wind. And in more scientific terms, it's usually referred to as aeolian erosion, with the word aeolian just meaning winds. But this here was still a pretty interesting discovery, and is part of the process usually referred to as hoodoo, something that you can usually find in a lot of different dry locations with a lot of wind that erodes rock over time. Here's actually one that looks even cooler, with this picture being taken in Turkey. If you want to learn more about this process, there is a link in the description. And actually a lot of these new pictures have been revealing some incredible detail when it comes to different types of erosion that occurred on Mars over the period of billions of years. Here is another beautiful image from the Curiosity rover that shows us various layers of deposit with quite a lot of erosion as well. But even though some processes are very similar to planet Earth, some are somewhat different, for one reason or another. For example, very recently, the scientists identified unusual green sand that was present in several locations on the surface of Mars. Or I guess slightly greenish in hue, not really green like typical grass or something. But nevertheless, this is an intriguing discovery because of what creates this hue, and also because it was actually discovered in a lot of different locations very close to Jezero crater. Now in this case, just like on Earth, the sand itself is formed through various aeolian processes that over time degrade the rock, turning it into tiny particles. But unlike on Earth, the sand here appears both red because of oxidation of various metallic components, and green because of the presence of what's known as olivine, the mineral responsible for various gems like peridot that you see right here. Which by itself is a pretty exciting discovery for various geologists, because it's going to provide them with a lot of information about the evolution of surface of Mars. We don't really know where this leads yet, but future will tell. And then we had this beautiful image that literally looks like an alien planet. The image showing us unusual formations, unusual polygons, and strange blue-like emissions coming from various regions, with a slightly zoomed-in version of this sort of looking like this. And these shapes are formed in slightly different ways. So the polygons are formed because of these seasonal changes. It's actually created by both water ice and carbon dioxide ice. And in this case, inside the soil, there are two types of ice, water ice and carbon dioxide ice. Water ice tends to form these unusual shapes, with the sublimation of CO2 ice when it gets a little bit warmer, creating all kinds of additional features, including various hair-like formations you see everywhere. Something that pretty much repeats every year on Mars, and something that can be compared to a water cycle here on planet Earth, except that here it's the CO2 cycle, and the actual liquid does not exist. The solid becomes gas, and the gas then becomes solid once again. But what about these unusual blue formations? Well, the explanation here is also pretty easy. All of this is produced by various types of underground deposits that essentially turn into gas and then become distributed across the surface on top of the ice itself. And this is actually something that's been seen in a lot of different places. And so none of these are features that have been unknown to us, and they've actually been explained years and years ago. But this new image is definitely very beautiful. And this one just looks really eerie. Although very similar features do exist even here on planet Earth, usually in very icy conditions, and of course have been seen on objects like Pluto, the image from which you see right here. Anyway, moving on to other discoveries in regards to water on Mars. Or at least water that used to exist here. Now, all of these new studies basically tell us that water was almost certain in a lot of different locations. And more specifically, several studies already discovered that there were a lot of different lakes and quite a lot of different deposits simply based on the observations of what's known as hydrated rocks. Here are just some of the detections from the recent study. And so some of the recent discoveries suggest that water was basically everywhere at some point, or almost everywhere. We're not sure how deep it was, or when exactly it disappeared yet, but the presence of water is definitely there. It's even been detected by the Chinese mission that has recently released all of its data, with the Zhurong rover that you see right here, that's actually traveled almost 2 kilometers in the last 780 days, releasing approximately 1.5 terabytes of data, discovering minerals that sometimes are referred to as dewey crust, which essentially represents a kind of a really hard layer on top, very often formed by the evaporation of water from underneath. In this case, suggesting a substantial liquid water activity based on several different minerals examined by the rover and by the lander. Which in this case implies that there was some kind of an ancient ocean in this region as well. And though it's not really that surprising to discover signs of water, the amount of water discovered in these studies is a little bit surprising. And I guess the bigger question is, where exactly did it all go? Did it go inside Mars? Did it escape into the atmosphere and then into the outer space? And is this basically what's going to happen to our planet at some point as well? But in terms of minerals, there was actually another discovery from not so long ago, specifically from the rock that you see right here, that the scientists are now referring to as the Wildcat Ridge, the rock that was recently drilled by the Perseverance rover. And so the rover in this case collected some of the samples from the surface of the rock and analyzed them using the instrument known as Sherlock, the instrument able to detect organic molecules. And in this case, the samples did indeed include some of the organic molecules, with the presence of certain sulfide minerals that, at least in theory, could have been produced by some kind of ancient life, although they could also be naturally produced through some other chemical reaction. But even though this particular molecule has actually been found before on Mars, in this case it was also found in a location that the scientists do believe could have supported life by being relatively habitable in the past. And moreover, quite a lot of these organic compounds have been discovered by this mission. And so at the moment, this is probably one of the more exciting discoveries coming from the mission, mostly because the scientists really want to understand where exactly these molecules are from. But then there were some other discoveries pertaining to the potential colonization of Mars sometime in the future, specifically the dangers of living on Mars. For example, one of the discoveries was of a completely new type of aurora, only visible in ultraviolet light, that seems to come in two different types. Sometimes it looks patchy, and sometimes it looks very localized. And in this case, it's what's known as the proton aurora, something that was originally found back in 2018, and something that occurs when the solar wind, which is essentially hydrogen atoms, strike the upper atmosphere of Mars and create various types of ultraviolet glow visible by these new instruments. And it looks like a lot of these patchy aurora seem to form when turbulent conditions around Mars let through some of the charged particles and then focus them on certain points following the magnetic lines, which forces some of these particles to glow, although the actual mechanism is still not clear. The scientists are still trying to figure out exactly why they're formed and how exactly they work, but we'll discuss some of these ideas in one of the previous videos you can find in the description. Either way though, this definitely tells us a little bit more about various types of radiations coming from the sun striking the surface of Mars, and will hopefully help us prepare for any potential mission. Then there was some good news. This is what's known as MOXIE, an instrument on the Perseverance rover whose main purpose was to try to create oxygen by using carbon dioxide, or essentially testing the electrolysis technology that converts CO2 into breathable oxygen. And the results from this were quite successful in the beginning of the mission. We've discussed this, I guess, a year and a half ago, but since then MOXIE has been used 7 times, and it produced a total of approximately 50 grams of oxygen, enough for a single person to breathe for almost 2 hours. Naturally providing some good news for any potential crewed mission that might happen one day in the future. And lastly, we have some new updates from the InSight mission. The mission that became famous for having so many different issues, with the recent one being dust. Dust covering everything, including the solar panels. But it's still active and it's still operating, and it's actually still sending some data back. And recently it sent some really intriguing data detecting first ever collisions of various meteoroids with the surface of Mars, but by literally listening to them. And in this case we also get to hear it as well. Let's actually listen first. And this sounds super cool, kind of sci-fi-ish actually. You actually are hearing as the meteoroid is entering the atmosphere, you're also hearing its explosion as the pieces hit the ground. All of this detected by super sensitive instruments on board the InSight mission. And in this case, it was able to pick up 4 separate objects, with all of them happening in 2020 and 2021. With the distances being between about 85 to 300 kilometers away from the location, suggesting of course that all of this was pretty far away, which also means that these instruments are just super sensitive. But it was really the collision from that first meteoroid that was the most exciting. It seemed to have separated into 3 separate shards, with all 3 then hitting the surface. And then all 3 were detected by the Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter when it flew past this location, confirming the collision and of course confirming the detection, with the other 3 also visible here as well. But here there's still a bit of a mystery. Between 2020 and 2021, only 4 of these collisions were detected, but technically the scientists expect way more. I mean, the surface of Mars is covered in different craters, so we do think that they should be more frequent. As a matter of fact, this mission has already detected approximately 1300 different earthquakes, or technically Marsquakes, and in that sense, we kind of expect to have just as many meteorite collisions as well, but they don't seem to happen as frequently for some reason. Although in this case, the scientists think that maybe it's because of the wind. Maybe the wind and the sounds from the wind cover some of these collisions, making them kind of difficult to hear. And so possibly by reanalyzing some of the data, they might discover some of the other ones that somehow was missed by scientists during the original analysis. And so that's pretty much it for now, for all of the updates from planet Mars. A lot of interesting things, a lot of new things, and quite a lot of things suggesting that maybe, just maybe, a crewed mission might be a reality, at least in some sense. Hello wonderful person, this is Anton, and welcome back to Mars. Today we're going to be discussing some of the recent discoveries in regards to the red planet, and specifically the discoveries in regards to the unusual dust storms that we've observed on Mars, the new discoveries about the Aurora on Mars, and even the discoveries in regards to the amount of radiation on the surface of this planet. and what we can do to try to prevent the radiation poisoning for future astronauts. With all of these studies in regards to all of this, as always, in the description below. And let's start with the most recent finding in regards to the dust storms. The unusual phenomena that are present on Mars during certain seasons, which can sometimes encompass the entire planet. For example, this iconic image from 2001 shows us what Mars sort of looks like before and during the dust storm. And we know that it can potentially cause some major problems for a lot of things operating on the surface. As you might be aware, in June of 2018, NASA has lost one of its major probes. The Opportunity rover that was active on Mars since 2004, unfortunately lost its ability to generate energy due to a massive dust storm in the mid-2018, which even during daytime would make these skies appear as you see them on the right, with Mars once again transforming so much that you couldn't even see the surface anymore. The image on the right here shows you what it looked like during the storm. And for the Opportunity that relied on its solar panels, here's what the skies would look like from the surface. There would be practically no sun whatsoever. Here's roughly how much energy was produced during this time, and notice how by June 10th, when the storm was at its peak, the amount of energy generated was only 22 watts. That's from the almost 700 watts generated in the beginning. With this being the last image taken by the Opportunity on June 10th of 2018. And now we have this other probe called InSight that's basically facing a very similar problem, with the dust slowly causing the probe to shut down over time. And because any future Martian mission would probably have to rely more on solar panels as opposed to a lot of other ways to generate energy such as nuclear power, it means that the scientists have to really figure out how these Martian storms operate, how to predict them, and more importantly, what we can possibly do to prevent their effects, or maybe find areas around Mars where the effects are not as dramatic. And so this recent study that you can find in the description tries to figure out exactly what causes these storms to become so powerful and what seasonal changes trigger certain dust storms. And this study relies on something known as the seasonal energy imbalance, also sometimes referred to as the radiant energy budget, with the main explanation being the solar energy, the amount of solar energy absorbed and released by the planet itself. So essentially it focuses on this balance between the absorption of energy and the release of energy. For example, we know that for our own planet, in terms of the seasonal and daily variations between the amount of energy absorbed and released from the sun, the so-called energy imbalance is approximately 0.4%. In other words, there's a little bit of a difference in terms of seasonal changes between how much energy is absorbed and released, with all of this being actively regulated by the planet itself through various gases in the atmosphere and through the presence of, for example, ice and snow on the surface, which tends to reflect light. But because it's about 0.4%, it means that our planet can generally maintain a relatively constant temperature. But Mars seems to have very strong seasonal and even daily variations in terms of the amount of energy that's radiated back from Mars. In other words, once in a while, the planet seems to have a very large imbalance, up to about 15.3%, which means that in between seasons, the amount of energy absorbed versus reflected can change by about 15.3%, and that is a huge imbalance compared to planet Earth with just 0.4%. This means that once in a while, during certain seasons, there's an excess of energy on the surface of the planet, and this could be one of the potential mechanisms generating these massive dust storms. For example, during the huge dust storm in 2001, the scientists discovered that the amount of power that was emitted from the planet decreased by 22% during daytime, but also increased by 29% during nighttime, with even more variation between seasons. So this could be the mechanism that's causing these storms to become so powerful, although the actual process is still unknown. You have to remember, this is still a correlation study, not a causation study. And so trying to understand how this energy imbalance might affect other planets, and also obviously figuring out exactly what this imbalance is for all of the planets in the solar system, could be one of the potential future studies and could help us understand how all of this works. But dust storms is just one of many problems we would have to deal on Mars if we were to establish a permanent human colony on the surface. We also have the issue of radiation, cosmic radiation, coming from both the sun and a lot of powerful objects around the universe. And because both NASA and even China are now planning to send astronauts to Mars, Both agencies are quite interested in trying to figure out how to potentially protect human life from exposure to a lot of radiation in the process. At the moment, it's believed that some of the first crewed missions might actually happen around the year 2033 and potentially then also in 2035 and 2037. Those are the years when Mars is going to be at just the right position for future missions to be launched from Earth. And so when it comes to trying to protect astronauts living here from potential radiation, there are obviously several solutions, although none of them currently would be very effective. First of all, there is a bit of an atmosphere on the planet. And surface pressure on Mars does change quite a lot depending on where you are. Certain locations which are much higher up, in this case visible in blue, will have much lower pressure and thus more radiation on the surface, whereas the much lower regions will usually contain much higher pressure and thus more atmosphere to absorb some of the cosmic rays coming from distant regions. Which means that we should probably try to aim to launch some of the crewed missions to some of these lower regions, such as for example in different deep craters where the surface pressure is already higher and thus a lot less protection is needed to create a livable habitat. And specifically here we're talking about the shielding that's required further on. And in this case the shielding is probably going to be made from the regolith on Mars, with the best type of habitat very likely being underground. And here the scientists determined that the depth has to be at least 1 meter deep to possibly 1.6 meters. Mostly because anything smaller than that can still create what's known as the cosmic ray showers. Basically when the cosmic ray hits for example, some kind of a shield, and then starts to create a lot of secondary particles and produces a relatively high neutron flux inside the spaceship or inside the habitat. Something that in this case the scientists believe peaks at around 30 centimeters or approximately 1 foot in depth. Which means that any kind of a protection on Mars has to be more than that, preferably at least 1 meter or 3 feet thick. And so by combining the information about the surface pressure with the maps of radiation on Mars, the scientists determined that some of the best locations for a potential future mission would probably be low-lying regions such as the famous Valles Marineris that you see right here, that doesn't just have high surface pressure on the inside, but also has recently been discovered to potentially possess water deposits somewhere in these regions as well. So it's very likely that some of the first crewed missions might actually be landing somewhere near this and then developing the first Martian colonies inside the valley itself. And since this is a pretty large structure, there is quite a lot of real estate to choose from. But obviously because this is still a decade away, we don't really know where all of this goes just yet. And last but not least, we also have certain discoveries in regards to the mysterious Martian aurora. The aurora that seem to be mostly visible in the UV light, but seem to always appear on the night side of the planet, and are definitely not produced in the same way like planet Earth. More importantly, the recent discoveries from the HOPE mission have also found that certain aurorae on Mars are very different both in shape and in appearance. But since Mars doesn't have any magnetosphere, it's always been kind of difficult to explain how these aurorae are formed. Naturally, because on Earth all of this is due to the magnetosphere of the planet, and the aurora generally follow the magnetic lines. And so in this case, the scientists used a lot of data collected by the MAVEN mission that's been orbiting Mars for a while now, with the probe itself also collecting data on the solar wind, which was also used for this study. And here they mostly compared the pressure of the solar wind and the UV data from Martian auroras, as well as the strength and the angle of various minute magnetic fields generated on the surface of Mars as a result of various solar activity. And it looks like, as a lot of scientists thought originally, the aurora here are essentially produced by very localized magnetic fields that seem to occur only in certain regions of the Martian crust, and usually in southern hemisphere. And this magnetic field is usually created from the interaction with the solar wind, with the aurora more or less concentrated near the areas that the scientists refer to as the strong crustal field regions, visible in this rectangle right there. And it looks like inside these regions, the aurora occurrence mostly depends on the orientation of the solar wind and the magnetic field. In other words, it becomes relatively easy for the scientists to predict the occurrence of the aurora. But outside of these regions, the aurora seem to be more connected to the overall pressure from the solar wind itself. So it looks like there are at least two ways of generating aurora on the surface of the planet, with the most powerful predictor being the sun itself. The more powerful the coronal mass ejection, the more stuff comes toward Mars, the more likely the aurora are to appear somewhere on the surface. Although interestingly, the power of the coronal mass ejection doesn't seem to influence the brightness of the aurora, with the aurora generated inside these crustal magnetic regions very likely being generated through various magnetic reconnection events kind of similar to planet Earth. But the mechanism itself is not super clear yet. It's just clear that these particular regions with higher content of various magnetic particles do seem to play a role. Although exactly what's producing these regions is also not clear yet because nobody has ever dug into those areas yet. But all of this is to some extent connected to what we're planning to do on Mars in the next few decades, a mission to Mars. A crewed mission to Mars, with astronauts very likely staying there for at least a few months. So by studying all of this and by discovering what conditions a human body will have to experience on the surface of this planet is of course really important in order to determine how we can safely both deliver and then return the astronauts from this planet. But at least for now, all of this is still very preliminary. We still don't really have a very good plan for how all of this will be executed, but hopefully in the next decade, all of this will become a little bit more obvious. Being able to fly a helicopter on Mars is actually a huge achievement, mostly because it was technically thought to be impossible up until I guess last year. As a matter of fact, some people thought that it's not possibly going to work, for one reason or another. I've actually explored some of these reasons in one of the older videos, where one really specific proposition and explanation was actually because of the amount of electrostatic electricity it was thought that all of this is going to generate, making the flight pretty much impossible. And that's of course because of the speed of the blades that's basically over 2000 times per minute, which does have a possibility to create a lot of static that would then destroy the helicopter. But as we now know, it works and it works really well. And so because of this, it's sort of natural to ask the next question. Can we now fly something else? For example, an airplane or maybe a balloon? Can we actually bring a lot of other equipment and technology to Mars and make it work there as well? Well, actually, a Mars aircraft is a mission that we're going to be talking about very soon, and it's currently being tested and developed as well, but that's not what I wanted to focus on today. Because my personal question for many years was, can we fly balloons on Mars? Can we have what NASA refers to as the aerobot mission? Basically a kind of a passive flyer that uses the idea of buoyancy, or essentially some kind of a balloon that flies around on a different planet. Now, as you might already know, or you might have heard from some of the previous videos, the first ever mission to ever fly on another planet was not the Martian helicopter, it was actually a balloon. It was a balloon on the planet Venus. And this was part of the program that was launched in the early 80s, that was actually a collaboration between the Soviet Union and several European countries, with France contributing the most. And this was known as the Vega mission. It was actually a multi-step mission that was technically trying to explore the Halley's Comet, but it also had the secondary mission of landing on Venus and using the balloons in its atmosphere. And that's actually the most exciting part, which kind of takes me to this less-known French astronomer / astrophysicist who kind of proposed this and who was super passionate about making this happen. If you're from France and if you're slightly older, you probably know who I'm talking about. Jacques Balmont, a brilliant French astronomer who passed away back in 2020, who essentially pushed for this program in the early 80s, and he was so passionate and so excited to have this happen that he basically designed and developed everything. And he basically designed the so-called Venus Vega balloons when he was the chief scientist for the French Space Agency, known in France as the National Center for Space Studies, or CNAS. And because of his passion and his ability to develop these balloons from scratch, he was able to convince the Soviet and the French government to essentially include them as part of the Vega mission, and they did, and it worked really well. And so when they were deployed in the Venusian atmosphere, they worked for approximately 46 hours. The actual balloon looks something like this. And they collect the data, they send the data back to planet Earth, and eventually after 46 hours they run out of battery, and for all we know, they're still flying around somewhere in the Venusian atmosphere. Although there is a high chance that the sulfuric acid might have finally eaten through the balloon's cover, and they basically popped and are now somewhere on the ground. But the important part here is that the helium balloon worked, and it worked really well, which gave Jacques Balmont an idea of now trying this on a different planet, planet Mars. And he actually worked on this for many years. As a matter of fact, the mission was very close to being finished and being launched to Mars to be tested in the early 90s. Then the Soviet Union fell apart, Russia became super corrupted and lost a lot of money, and the mission was cancelled over time. But the main idea behind the mission was definitely feasible, and it almost happened. In other words, we were super close to having not a helicopter as the first mission on Mars, but an actual air balloon similar to the one on Venus. Now we're talking about the flying mission, of course. And technically this could have been the first long-term robotic mission before the NASA's rovers. As a matter of fact, apparently the French agency has actually conducted quite a lot of experiments using the so-called Montgolfier balloons, performing over 30 flights in the 70s, going all the way to the early 90s. The word Montgolfier usually refers to the so-called hot air balloon, basically a balloon that heats up the air and makes it fly above the ground. Although in this case they would not really be using air, but they would actually be using either helium or hydrogen. But more about this in a few minutes. The important part here is that it worked, and they've tested this on Earth, reaching the altitude of about 35 kilometers. And that's actually part of the Earth's atmosphere that's very similar to the surface of Mars. And interestingly, one of their balloons was able to stay afloat in that very high altitude for approximately 69 days. Which basically means we had the technology to launch all of this back in the early 90s. But because of the cancellation of the Russian Mars 96 probe and the eventual failure of this entire program, we unfortunately never got to learn what would happen if the balloon was actually delivered to Mars. But my question was always, can it work? Would it work? If we were to send a balloon there, would it actually fly? Would it be better than a helicopter? Can it stay afloat for a long time? And so in this video, I wanted to explore some of these ideas, talk a little bit more about the science of a flying balloon on another planet, such as Mars, and also talk about what NASA is actually planning. Let's start with the science. So first of all, NASA is planning these balloons and similar missions to planets like Venus, because this is something that we know works really well. But what about Mars? Well, when it comes to balloons, it's really all about buoyancy and pressure. Buoyancy is of course the reason why the balloon goes up in the air, and the pressure in this case adds to the amount of force that sort of lifts the balloon. When it comes to simple balloons, like the ones that we use at birthday parties, they generally don't survive very long. As a matter of fact, most of them very likely pop at the altitude of about 10 kilometers, assuming that they're filled with normal helium. But some of the more advanced balloons, specifically meteorological or scientific balloons, can easily reach altitudes of 30 kilometers or even higher. The current record belongs to the Japanese Space Agency that launched a balloon known as BU-60 that you can learn more about in the link in the description below that explains what they did back in the early 2000s, that was able to reach the altitude of about 53 kilometers, which if you were to compare to the surface of Mars, would actually be much lower in pressure compared to what you would experience on the surface of Mars or even in some of the higher altitudes. In other words, theoretically, this balloon could fly on Mars. And that's because, as I mentioned earlier, the density on the surface here is equivalent to the density of air at an altitude of 35 kilometers or 22 miles above the Earth's surface, or basically the atmospheric pressure of about 0.6%. But the atmosphere of Earth is slightly different from the atmosphere of Mars. So the gas that we use here does actually matter. Normally all of the high altitude balloons are filled with helium because it's lighter than the air, and also because unlike hydrogen, that's also much lighter than the air as well, it doesn't explode when exposed to oxygen. The famous Hindenburg accident was unfortunately because of this, because hydrogen in this case reacted with oxygen and exploded, causing the disaster that basically ended the idea of hydrogen-based balloons. And so let's say that we bring some kind of a balloon to Mars, and we bring a balloon with either helium or hydrogen. Would it work? And so here we have to do a bit of a scientific analysis and very simple math to figure things out. How do balloons work on Earth? So let's just say that this is a helium balloon floating in the air. In this case, a cubic meter of air on Earth at sea level is going to weigh approximately 1.3 kilograms. But a cubic meter of helium is going to be much lighter, approximately 0.2 kilograms. Whereas hydrogen is going to be even lighter at 0.1 kilograms. And because of this difference, it means that the balloon is going to be receiving a kind of a pressure from the air itself, and is going to have a lifting capacity of the difference between the weight. In case of helium, it's 1.3 minus 0.2 or 1.1 kilogram, which is quite a lot of lift. It means that a balloon that's approximately 10 cubic meters in size is going to be receiving almost 10 kilograms of lift. Actually, even a little bit more than that. And the bigger the balloon, the more lift it's going to get. With hydrogen, it's going to be just a little bit more. But naturally, the atmosphere of Mars is very different from the one on Earth. It's much thinner and produces way less lift. So while on Earth, a cubic meter is approximately 1.3 kilograms, on Mars, a cubic meter of atmosphere on the surface is approximately 0.02 kilograms, or basically 20 grams. While 1 cubic meter of helium is going to weigh approximately 0.001 kilograms, or approximately 1 gram. For hydrogen, it's going to be about half a gram. And so even though helium on hydrogen is a little bit lighter, the actual lifting capacity of the air or of the Martian atmosphere is dramatically lower. It means that to basically lift a heavier object, you suddenly require much higher volumes of either helium or hydrogen. In rough terms, you need about 500 times as much helium on Mars to lift the same object as high up in the air as you would on Earth. Or in other words, the balloon has to be about 500 times bigger. In more practical terms, a balloon size of a house would only be able to lift approximately 1 kilogram of material, and that includes the weight of the balloon itself. So if the balloon itself is made from slightly heavier material, in order to prevent it from popping, it might not even be able to fly if it's over 1 kilogram. So for example, in order to lift a larger rover or some kind of a probe that's possibly hundreds of kilograms in weight, you would need a balloon larger than your typical stadium. That's a huge balloon. That's bigger than any balloon we've ever created here on Earth. But that's of course using typical balloon technology. The French studies from the 80s and the 90s determined that if we were to use balloons using what's known as the hot air balloon, it might be possible to actually use hydrogen to lift things much more efficiently. And that's something that NASA has determined as well, using their own tests that happened afterwards. NASA has what's known as the Wallops Flight Facility that usually does a lot of different flight tests. The link for this and other stuff is in the description below, that essentially show that some of these balloon designs could be feasible for Mars as well. With the most exciting design being known as the solar heated balloon, also known as the solar balloon. The balloon that essentially gets a lot of its buoyancy from the air that's heated by the solar radiation. And so essentially by heating the balloon using the sun itself, it becomes possible for these balloons to float during the day and then land somewhere on the ground during the night. That's one of the possible missions that's explored by NASA. But obviously by landing in the balloon at night every single night, it does create a lot more opportunities for the mission to fail. So it's probably better to have something that's a little bit more stable and that always stays in the air, independent of the temperature or the time of the day. And so in this case, instead of using the solar balloon, it might be better to use what's known as the superpressure balloon, the balloon that provides much more stability during the long duration missions. We've actually briefly talked about this in one of the last videos that should be somewhere right there or in the description, but in the last few years, NASA's experiments determined that by using a kind of a pumpkin-shaped balloon, it might be possible to have a permanent telescope orbiting around the planet for many weeks or even months at a time. And by using a similar shape and a similar technology, it could be possible to have something on Mars as well. And so there's at least one paper that you can find in the description below that was published by NASA a few years ago that goes through a lot of detail about this. And it essentially determines that it's quite possible to have some kind of a balloon mission one day in the future. Although in this case, using helium is probably not going to be very efficient. Because Mars does not have much oxygen in its free form in the atmosphere, using hydrogen is much better. It's lighter and it's also a little bit easier to deploy. And so in case of a balloon mission on Mars, hydrogen works best. But it also has to be super pressurized as well, basically under a lot of pressure in order to create the most lift possible. Although it does only provide approximately 5% more efficiency when it comes to lift compared to helium. But helium is more expensive and hydrogen is everywhere, so there's that advantage as well. Although unfortunately the so-called MAVVAP mission, or the Mars Balloon Validation Program, has been only talked about for the past 2 decades. It still hasn't happened. And I was actually wondering why. Well, it turns out that during the exploration missions by NASA, and even during some of the earlier French missions, they actually determined that the most difficult part of this is the deployment. It's surprisingly difficult to inflate and to pressurize the balloon without popping it and without basically causing it to explode or to fly away uncontrollably. We're talking about remote conditions on Mars, not here on planet Earth. And so in other words, one of the main reasons why NASA never really tried this mission is because they couldn't really figure out how to make the balloon inflate and how to make it fly afterwards. With the other main challenge being the reasons. So in this case, NASA really needed to have a mission that needs a balloon, not really a balloon that for some reason needs to have a mission. Or in other words, why bring a balloon to Mars if you can achieve everything by using a rover? So in this case, it was basically kind of redundant. But recently, the scientists realized that we could use a magnetometer, an instrument used to measure the magnetosphere, that could then be used on Mars to map the magnetosphere of the entire planet. And all of this could be done by putting it on a balloon that flies around the atmosphere and collects all of the data over time. And so in other words, at least one type of a mission could definitely benefit from having a balloon on Mars. But at the moment, nothing is practically being planned just yet. It could definitely work though. It's just not being explored actively by any of these space agencies. Although I personally would love to hear about a balloon on Mars. I mean, how cool is that? Especially because there are at least 3 different types of balloons that could definitely work here. We have the high pressure helium balloon that would most likely fly at very constant altitude and would be a perfect opportunity for some kind of a long duration mission. We have the hot air balloon that would most likely use solar heating in order to have the balloon fly really high up in the air during the day, but then possibly land during the nighttime, which could also provide the opportunity to explore the surface of Mars. And then we have the super pressure pumpkin-shaped balloon that's usually used here on Earth for a lot of different atmospheric studies, that's known to be able to circulate around the planet for several weeks at a time without losing any altitude, by being able to maintain constant high pressure on the inside, but also having a very specific shape that provides the most stability and the most buoyancy. Which essentially means that these missions, if they ever occur, would very likely work. It just, right now, we don't really have a reason for any of these missions. It would definitely be cool, and it would definitely be quite interesting, but in terms of the actual science or experiments, it would not really be that useful. Unless we use the balloons to measure the magnetosphere, or we can figure out some other important reason to use them, something that cannot be done by anything else, like for example, a rover. And so that's kind of where we are right now. The theory is there, it can definitely work, assuming the right shape and the right pressure, but there's just no need for it yet. And because these missions are pretty expensive, it would be difficult to convince NASA or any other space agency to launch one anytime soon. But it doesn't mean that it's not going to happen. As a matter of fact, chances are it might happen very soon. Because as far as I know, nobody expected the helicopter mission to ever work or to even happen. And so, for all we know, balloons are next. First, there was a face on Mars. Wait, not this one. This one. Then there was another face on Mars. This time, it appeared to be Gandhi. Yeah, this Gandhi. And then there was this. Some sort of a dude walking across Mars. And now we have something entirely different. We have what appears to be a doorway on Mars. What is going on? Hello wonderful person, this is Anton, and today we're going to be talking a little bit more about all of the stuff that we've been finding on Mars over the past few years. Although it's really more of a psychological exploration than it is of actual things being found. But more specifically, we're going to discuss this doorway on Mars, how it was most likely produced, and discuss some of the other really unusual, really weird, really strange objects and things and shapes discovered on Mars in the last few decades. Starting of course with that first face, the iconic face on Mars, that was even featured in the episode of the X-Files. And if you've been following the story long enough, you know that, well, first of all, there is no face. Here's what the high-resolution image of all of this looks like. And though it does have some facial features here and there, the three-dimensional reconstruction of all of this determined that it's actually a somewhat interesting geological structure. But seeing faces in a lot of different objects and a lot of different types of features, such as for example right here, face of a Mickey Mouse, is known as pareidolia, a concept that refers to seeing actual shapes or actual objects in something that is not an actual shape or an object. Such as for example seeing the smiley face in this, which just happens to be the backside of a military jet. And naturally, seeing faces, recognizing faces, or trying to understand what these faces try to portray to us is part of the natural survival for the human species, with pareidolia being a very important natural adaptation for a very social species like us. But object recognition and facial recognition takes a relatively large part of our brain, specifically the occipital lobe, in order to function properly. And it's actually known that a damage to this area can often lead to a lot of different disorders where people are unable to recognize objects or faces. The most famous example is what's known as prosopagnosia, also known as face blindness, the inability to recognize faces or sometimes even know that you're looking at an actual person, with the area right there being responsible for all of this. Apparently Brad Pitt has this, but I think the most famous example is a very famous psychologist/author, Oliver Sacks, who even wrote a very famous, very interesting book, the book known as A Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat, which apparently literally happened. Someone thought that his wife's face was his hat. And that of course is a little bit off track from what we're talking about, but it is all related. Our brains are extremely good at recognizing objects and even trying to make objects out of something that is not an object. Such as this little dude right here, which when examined closer, turned out to be a rock that was just shaped in a very different way. Same thing with the face right here, and the same for the picture of Gandhi's profile. Well, what about this doorway here? Well, once again, this is a type of pareidolia. We're seeing a human object, a doorway, in something that is naturally occurring and something that is produced geologically. Something that we have a pretty solid explanation for. By the way, the picture itself is available in the description below. And in order to figure this out, let's take a look at this beautiful panorama created by Neville Thompson using the data and all of the images collected by NASA. The doorway is somewhere right there. You can actually zoom into it and try to take a look at it in a little bit more detail. You'll notice that as you zoom in, things start to appear that you weren't really seeing before. Specifically, well, it's not a doorway, it seems to be just a large crack. In other words, nothing here is going anywhere. And second of all, the edges are not as straight as they looked from a distance. So, alien door, it is not. But what is it, and how was it created? By the way, this image was taken only on May 7th of 2022, and it's taken with a camera known as Mastcam. Well, the solution to this problem lies right next to it. Okay, maybe it's a little bit more difficult to see, but here we go. Notice something right next to it? Well, this rock, if you were to pick it up, would most likely fit inside this. With this by itself being approximately 3 feet long or about 1 meter in height, and that just happens to fit right here. With the answer being erosion. All of this was most likely caused by erosion, and the more detailed answer being available once we once again zoom into the doorway itself. Although I keep calling it doorway, it's not. It's just a, I guess, hallway. No, that's also a bad name. It's a natural hole produced by erosion. So here, if we were to zoom in again, we'll start seeing what's known as strata, different layers inside the rock. And it also appears to be silt beds, something made out of relatively hard sand. With all of this very likely being sediments deposited when Mars was still liquid. Basically liquid ocean or liquid sea deposits. Although it could also be just a river as well. And since then, for billions of years, all of this was slowly degraded by the thin Martian atmosphere, eroding different layers, exposing them to the surface, eventually causing different layers to become exposed, with all of this at some point becoming relatively unstable and the gravity causing the chunk right here to crack open and to fall. Although it's quite likely that there might have been also an earthquake involved, which we know happened on Mars, with one of the recent ones detected and explored in one of the previous videos right there, or in the description. As a matter of fact, there is a possibility that the recent Marsquake that was approximately 5.0 on Richter scale could have produced this to begin with, especially because the erosion levels on the inside are not as high as on the outside, suggesting that this is a more recent development and something that didn't happen too long ago, although exactly when we don't really know. And the thing is, if you look around this image, you'll discover some other relatively straight lines, and specifically relatively straight cracks, which at least in theory can also produce other doorways as well. There's another one right here. No aliens involved, nothing unusual. Moreover, you can see quite a lot of signs of erosion that happened over billions of years, pretty much across this entire area, with quite a lot of large rocks present in other regions as well, which also were very likely produced in a relatively similar manner. Here's actually another one that seems to have produced some kind of a triangular structure as well. Once again with a lot of vertical cracks and even horizontal cracks, which are more or less straight. So basically these fractures are absolutely natural. Moreover, similar structures exist on Earth and have been detected in a lot of different places on the planet. As a matter of fact, if you just Google unusual rock structure on Earth, you'll find like hundreds of them. But honestly, the most famous one, and I guess my favorite one, the one that's led to even almost like a religious cult, is the iconic structure known as Al-Nasla, the very strange rock with a very straight line right in the middle. All of this located in Saudi Arabia. And strangely enough, it's still not entirely clear how exactly this was produced, but it's very likely because of, once again, corrosion and also periodic rain, with most likely some kind of a sandy deposit present between the rocks, which eventually turned into this relatively straight line. But as you can imagine, people tend to explain this as some kind of an alien laser, or maybe some other laser from somewhere else. Anyway, we know that this is natural and it's been studied for many years. But to scientists, finding these strange formations on Mars and actually studying them in detail helps them figure out what sort of geological processes Mars as a planet has gone through in the last few billions of years. And so by using various rovers and by looking at all of these formations, it becomes possible to reconstruct the history of the planet. And as you can imagine, quite a lot of different unusual formations have been found in the past, with some of them potentially only existing on Mars and nowhere else, with many of them eventually leading to, once again, pareidolia. Even from some really iconic people that are generally considered to be ridiculously smart. Let me give you the most famous example, Arthur C. Clarke. Yeah, the 2001 Space Odyssey Arthur C. Clarke. A tremendously brilliant individual, and a person that's highly respected, but everyone is fallible and everyone makes mistakes. And so did he in 2001. Using the pictures from Mars Global Surveyor collected back in 2001, the actual 2001, not the movie, Arthur C. Clarke believed that he might have seen trees in some of the photos, and even detected certain types of branches that seemed to vary seasonally. And at that point he made a really strong argument that what we are looking at is vegetation, very likely Martian trees. And from this angle it does kind of resemble something tree-like. And some of these branchy formations look very extraordinary. And they also change seasonally, they do disappear and they change in shape, while others resemble tiny spiders, once again to some extent changing in shape every season. And well, here's one of the more detailed images taken in the last few years. Today these are known as Martian spiders. You can read a little bit more about this from one of these articles in the description. And more officially it's known as the araeniform terrain. A kind of a mound that seems to form when carbon dioxide ice below the surface heats up and starts to release gas, which is an active seasonal process, but it's not seen anywhere else in the solar system because nothing else has these conditions. And because this is Mars, here the CO2 doesn't melt, CO2 ice just sublimates, turning into gas directly and creating these formations in the process. So in essence, it's formed through carbon dioxide gas building up a lot of pressure and eventually breaking through the surface, with jets erupting as dust, with the darker dust deposited around the vent and then transported by the winds as well, eventually producing the streaks you're observing. But once again, because this is seasonal, it changes every single Martian year, and from a distance appears as if something is moving on the surface, something that could resemble trees or basically spiders. But once again, natural, explained, and even recreated here on Earth several times. As a matter of fact, we've discussed a lot of these in some of the previous videos, somewhere right there or maybe in the description. And so here it's really important to understand that a lot of these extraordinary assumptions or propositions often end up being nothing else but, well, just unexplained phenomena that we do not have on planet Earth. You might want to explore this other video I made on the so-called Martian blueberries, which were suggested to be mushrooms, where we've discussed this in more detail, and I've even showed you examples from planet Earth where we have very similar formations, and they're not mushrooms or blueberries, they're just rocks. And that's the thing about Mars. It has very different geology to planet Earth, so we expect to find different types of weird rocks, or unusual shapes that we don't see anywhere else and might even resemble objects we're used to, hearts, angels, weird bone-like structures, but none of them are. All of these are just unusual rocks, or other peculiar geological structures because of the interaction of CO2 and because of the seasonal changes on the planet. And I think this is a perfect example of how this works on Mars. 9 years apart, the image looks relatively different and shows us how Mars can actually change quite a lot, with a lot of surface features changing in the process. In this case, the changes were entirely due to the melting of the ice on the surface. But in other cases, it's really due to unusual dune formations or different types of structures which simply don't exist on Earth because the Martian atmosphere is much thinner, and so the erosion here works a little bit differently. As a matter of fact, here's a really good example of how different and strange Mars is compared to our own planet. These dune-like formations are actually formed by very neat piles of what seems to be rocks. And they might have been formed through the so-called freeze and thaw cycle, where with every single season, the rocks were slowly moved into tighter and tighter shapes by the ice around them and eventually produced what you're seeing here. And it becomes a little bit more obvious once you zoom into the picture and explore some of the rocky formations. I guess it's still kind of hard to see, but that's what the scientists got out of this picture. And some formations are truly unique. We definitely don't see anything like this on Earth. Today the scientists are not entirely sure what this is caused by, but they think it's maybe dry ice sliding down these sandy dunes. Although initially it was even proposed that this could be signs of maybe liquid water, but then it was disproven pretty quickly. And so when it comes to mysterious, unusual objects, Mars definitely has a lot to offer. But we always have to remember about pareidolia. We have to remember that what we're seeing is probably not what we're seeing. As a matter of fact, in the past, most of the first explanations for various phenomena have been proven incorrect once the additional observations have been provided. And though a lot of these explanations ended up to be mundane, many of them helped us realize Mars is just very different. But because we're human and because we tend to explain mundane things with extraordinary explanations, which also is a psychological thing, which we'll probably talk about in some of the future videos, this unusual formation instantly became the so-called alien doorway. But doorway it is not. Well, on that note, you can as always find all of the links in the description below, and you can also explore the picture by yourself by using one of the links. Once we discover more unusual stuff on Mars, or once we actually find something that's difficult to explain scientifically, I'll make sure to follow this up with another video. Hello wonderful person, this is Anton, and today we're going to be discussing some of the major updates from our neighbor Mars, but I guess more specifically from the Martian NASA mission, referred to as Mars 2020, with the rover known as Perseverance and the tiny helicopter known as Ingenuity. And in the last few months, since the last update video that you can find somewhere in the description or above my head, there actually have been some major discoveries / updates, including some discoveries that we're going to be talking about in this video that were somewhat surprising. And so let's jump right into this and let's discuss one of the most recent discoveries coming from the Perseverance rover, and specifically coming from one of the instruments inside the rover known as the SuperCam microphone. The two microphones located on the rover that allow the rover to hear the sounds on Mars, with some of the recordings that have been previously made available in the description below. And so the most recent study and the most recent analysis coming from the rover was actually able to very accurately measure the speed of sound on Mars. Now, this is something that I personally was really surprised by, because I've actually made a video about this based on a lot of research a couple of years ago, a video that you can also find in the description or somewhere right there. And in that particular video, we've talked about what sound on Mars might actually sound like, and also what sort of frequencies are going to be most prominent. But this recent research sort of discovered something almost entirely different. But it also was able to calculate the actual speed as well, determining that the speed of sound on Mars seems to be around 240 meters per second. Now, when it comes to speed of sound, it obviously is different depending on the temperature, depending on the condition, and more specifically depending on the density of the material. So for example, even though here on planet Earth, in the regular temperature of around 20 degrees Celsius, the speed of sound is about 343 meters per second, which is approximately 100 meters per second faster than on Mars, this actually suddenly changes in a much more dense material such as water, where the speed of sound is 1400 or actually 1480 meters per second. And the more dense the material, the faster the speed. But as you probably know, the atmosphere on Mars is less than 1% as thick as the one on Earth. So here we do expect the speed of sound to be much lower. Although I guess in theory you would expect it to be even lower than 240 meters per second. So it is pretty fast nevertheless. But this is of course not the surprise that was discovered. The surprise itself was in regards to the frequencies and how they differ in terms of speed. So first of all, in order to calculate all of this, the rover had to use its laser, because by firing the laser, certain sounds were produced on the ground. But by measuring the time between the laser firing and the sound waves hitting one of the microphones inside the rover, the NASA team was able to actually very accurately calculate how various frequencies were reaching the microphone and how long it took for various frequencies of sound to reach the microphone. And what they've discovered is that the middle frequencies here were traveling at a very different speed. With all of this most likely due to the carbon dioxide molecule present at very low pressures. And so at frequencies above approximately 240 Hz, the molecules of carbon dioxide start to interact in such a way that they don't actually have enough time to relax, which creates very unusual conditions where the higher the frequency, the faster the sound travels, with everything above 240 Hz traveling approximately 10 meters per second faster. Which of course suggests that if you were to somehow be able to talk on Mars without, I guess, the suit here protecting you, your voice would sound extremely different. First of all, you would hear a lot of high frequency sounds, followed by a kind of an echo of low frequency sounds. Something that I think I would love to simulate one day, but I just don't really know how to do this yet. But that's of course assuming that you're able to talk on Mars without your helmet. That's not really something we can do yet because of the low pressures. But then on top of this, right above the surface, there's actually a slightly thinner layer known as the planetary boundary layer. And today it's believed that during the daytime, because of the additional warmth from the sun, all of this generates a lot of different convection currents, which probably change the way sound behaves as well. But that's not something we can investigate just yet, simply because it's kind of difficult to simulate all of this. Which means that the sound on Mars is probably a little bit different from what we thought. Okay, well then we have other updates, specifically from the incredible Ingenuity helicopter. The helicopter that's now completed over 20 flights, and obviously has achieved so much more than anyone ever expected. As a matter of fact, as of making of this video, it just completed its 22nd flight and it's about to start its 23rd flight, covering the total of distance of approximately 4.75 kilometers, with a total flight time of over 40 minutes, which is already groundbreaking on so many different levels. And since that last update, it did actually experience some problems. Specifically, it lost communication on flight 17 and even had a bit of a problem landing during flight 18. Mostly because the area where it was landing did not have enough features for the helicopter to establish correct height. And later on, flight 19 had to be postponed because of a relatively large dust storm that was approaching Jezero crater, which of course is the first time ever a weather delayed any kind of a flight on another planet. And during that Martian storm, the total sunlight received by the probe reduced by approximately 18%, while also surprisingly lowering the total density of the air on Mars by approximately 7%. And remember, the helicopter depends on the air density for its ability to fly, while obviously also depending on the sun for its energy. And so in this case, the scientists behind the mission had to wait approximately a month before they could continue flying the helicopter and continue assessing the results. And following the storm, quite a lot of dust was deposited on various parts of the helicopter. For example, they discovered that quite a lot of dust was on the navigation camera. And so in order to prevent various types of errors accumulating in a helicopter, the scientists had to update some of the software and include what's known as the image mask, as well as run several tests using the servo mechanisms available in a helicopter in order to provide enough data for the imaging sensor to then be able to navigate around Mars. On top of this, by running various tests using the servos, they were able to clear some of the sand that accumulated in the moving parts responsible for the motion of the rotor. And so following all of this, the Flight 19 was obviously a success as well. Then, during the flight number 20, it was actually able to fly for approximately 390 meters, and during the flight 21 was able to fly 370 meters, with the main mission now being scouting ahead of the rover, the Perseverance rover, and providing a lot of visual data of the area nearby. But the 22nd flight was not as exciting, with the helicopter only flying approximately 70 meters instead of the planned 350. But that's because it's actually preparing for a somewhat dangerous maneuver for the Flight 23, where it's going to be flying around a hill, and in order to do so, it's going to have to make a really sharp turn. In other words, it's not going to be a straight flight anymore. Nevertheless, so far this has been a super successful mission, and I'm only looking forward to see how far NASA can take this. But what about the rover itself? Well, one of the main problems with the rover so far has actually been rocks. A lot of rocks started to accumulate in various parts of the Perseverance rover. So for example, for quite a while there was a rock inside one of the wheels on the rover. which is of course kind of similar to what happened to the Curiosity rover back in 2017. But that by itself is not a problem, and NASA has never really had problems with rocks causing anything inside the wheels. A much bigger problem was from this part right here. The part that essentially collects these samples for the future mission that's going to be retrieving these samples. And you can kind of see that quite a lot of rocks accumulated in this area. With NASA recently choosing to dump some of the samples by opening the tubes in order to clear the debris that was getting stuck in the sample collector, which is naturally one of the problems NASA did not anticipate, and so they're going to have to find a lot of creative solutions if this happens again. And since the earliest date for the retrieval of these samples is around 2026 or possibly even in the 2030s, with the Lockheed Martin recently receiving the contract to develop the retrieval system for this mission, all of this means that the Martian rover has to survive for quite a few years and try to protect its sample collector in order to collect as many rocks as possible. And so at least for now, the NASA scientists might have to develop a slightly different technique for the retrieval part in order to avoid these anomalies in the future. But despite all of this, at least one major mystery coming from the Perseverance so far is actually in regards to rocks. Relatively recently, some of the analysis of the rocks available on the surface of Mars uncovered some unusual purple formations that to some extent resemble similar rocks we have here on planet Earth. Here's an example from Australia. And we sometimes refer to this as a rock varnish, a type of a coating that sometimes forms in various types of rocks because of the activity of various cyanobacteria on the surface of these formations. In other words, this is something that's formed by bacterial life, usually in the presence of water. And so one of the questions here is, of course, did something similar happen on Mars, and are these the signs of potentially ancient cyanobacterial life present on Mars as well? But even though right now it's kind of too early to tell, right now the scientists are using one of the laser instruments to try to drill to this and to try to see what they discover in terms of the chemical composition of these unusual rocks. So definitely quite a lot of exciting discoveries. And last but not least is this other thing that you can actually check out by yourself, which in this case is not part of the NASA mission, but is part of the United Arab Emirates mission known as HOPE. And essentially they were able to create a really detailed and somewhat interesting atlas of Mars, naturally available for free in the link in the description below. And overall this represents a really interesting read for anyone interested in learning more about what we know about Mars today, including of course the naming of most of the locations, why they're named so, and what we know about each of them in regards to geology and potential existence of liquid water. So do check it out in one of the links in the description below. But I guess on this note, that's pretty much all I wanted to mention. We might come back and talk more about this particular atlas, or obviously some of the new discoveries coming from the NASA mission, but for now that's all I wanted to mention. On that note, thank you for watching, subscribe if you still haven't, share this with someone who loves learning about space and sciences, and maybe come back tomorrow to learn something else. Maybe support this channel on Patreon by joining channel membership, or by buying the Wonderful Person t-shirt you can find in the description. Stay wonderful, I'll see you tomorrow, and as always, bye bye.